And please let me know when you start the recording for the record.
We're recording.
Perfect. Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Iram, and hold on a second. I'm going to be sharing my screen. Okay, can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. So good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Los Angeles Water Board's MS4 workshop, Manner of TMDL Incorporation in the Regional MS4 Permit. My name is Iram Razak, and I am an environmental scientist in the Municipal Stormwater Permitting Unit. Today, I will be your host and moderator. I'm also joined by my fellow co-hosts and moderators, Unit Chief Ivar Ridgway, and my colleague, Rebecca Chrisman. Also in attendance is our board members, Chair Munoz, Vice Chair Yee, Board Member Stahl, Board Member Guzman, and Board Member Stringer. We also have with us our legal counsel, Jennifer Fordyce, Tamron Austin, Sophie Furlich, and Adriana Nunez. From our executive office, we have Executive Officer Renee Purdy and Assistant Executive Officer Jenny Newman. Additionally, from the Regional Programs section, joining us today is Section Chief Dr. Albi Nye. Last but not the least, we have my colleagues from the MS4 unit, Susanna Vargas, Ali Raza Rahmani, Alex Carlos, and Angane Shanazarian. I will start off with some Zoom instructions. So this meeting is being recorded. And so I also want everyone to take note that all written questions and comments in the Q&A function, which is found at the bottom of your screen, your Zoom control bar, as well as any responses to poll questions are being automatically recorded by Zoom. If you encounter any technical difficulties, the best solution is to leave the meeting and join again. If technical difficulties persist, please email Alex Carlos, and Alex Carlos's email is listed on my slide here, alex.carlos@waterboards.ca.gov. Now I wanted to just briefly do a poll and just to gauge who is in our audience today. So once I start the poll, you will see a window that pops up on your screen, and please choose the option that best describes you. And I will give about maybe 30 seconds or more just so everyone gets a chance to answer the poll. So I will now launch the poll. Okay, wonderful. It looks like most people have answered the poll, so I'm going to end the poll and share results. Wonderful. Thank you, everyone, for joining. I see a lot of people. Wow, this is amazing. So we have a lot of permittees in attendance, many from Los Angeles County. We have a good amount from Ventura County, and I see a lot of consultants and attorneys representing permittees, and some non-governmental organizations as well. And looks like we may have some staff from Water Board and Cal EPA. So thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm gonna stop sharing results and move on to talk about the agenda today. So for today, we are going to start with speaker presentations and then a question and answer session. Then we'll take about a 10-minute break around 11 o'clock and then continue the speaker presentations. Towards the end of the day, we will have a section to allow board members to discuss and comment on what they have heard today. And then to end with, I will talk about some next steps. So for ground rules, just like any other workshop, we also have ground rules for today's workshop. First and foremost, please focus your comments and questions to today's workshop topic. Also, because we have a very tight agenda, we would ask speakers to please be attentive of your allotted speaking time so that we can also allow everybody to a chance to speak and give time at the end to board members for discussion. When it is your turn to speak, you will be elevated to a panelist. Please unmute and, if desired, turn on your video. And to the extent that anyone has a PowerPoint presentation today, please identify who you are representing prior to the presentation on the record. We're asking that everyone with a written presentation do that today, even if you've already done it on the presentation itself, just so that the record is clear and reflects everything accurately. During the presentation, for the purposes of helping you keep your time, you will get a 1 minute warning. So now I will discuss the question and answer session, or what we know as Q&A. So this question and answer session will allow both board members and other workshop participants to provide any questions or comments after every presentation. We will first prioritize questions and comments from board members, and then we will take questions and comments from other meeting participants as time allows. Please concisely frame your question and specifically explain who the question is directed to. Board members, so I have a snapshot of the Zoom control bar on my screen. So this can be found at the bottom of your screen. Board members, if you wish to speak or comment, please click on the raise hand button. And then when we call on you, you can click on the unmute function, and that will allow you to speak. For our other workshop participants, you can use the Q&A function also found on the Zoom control bar, and that will enable you to type in your questions, and we will be able to see them and answer those we will try our best to answer those. So now I would like to turn it over to Jenny Newman to talk more about today's discussion.
Thank you, Iram. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the workshop. I'm going to go over the objectives for the meeting, so I'll just read this slide. The objectives for today are to discuss incorporation of TMDLs and MS4 permits, and the laws, regulations, guidance, and facts governing different approaches to TMDL incorporation. The workshop will also allow permittees and other stakeholders to share their perspectives, specific ideas for TMDL incorporation, issues, and interests. And finally, we hope the workshop will provide board members the opportunity to ask questions and discuss approaches for incorporating TMDLs into the Regional MS4 Permit. I think I'm going, next slide, please. Great. For today's workshop, we would like speakers to specifically answer the questions we provided in the public notice. These questions are, what are your concerns, if any, regarding the proposed manner of TMDL incorporation as set forth in the fact sheet and corresponding parts of the tentative order? Are there ways in which your concerns could be addressed within the proposed manner of TMDL incorporation as set forth in the tentative regional MS4 permit. Do you have an alternative proposal for TMDL incorporation in the regional MS4 permit? Please provide detailed language and a framework for incorporation. Note that the focus of this workshop today is on matter of TMDL incorporation. Please save any comments on TMDL compliance deadline extensions and other comments on the tentative permit for future public workshops and board meeting standing items. Moving on, here we go. I have the order of speakers up on this slide. We will shortly be hearing from speakers 1 through 4, starting with the LA Water Board presentation. Then we'll have Arnie Anselm representing Ventura County permittees, Travis Van Lyten representing the City of Duarte, and a joint presentation from Gila Bay, NRDC, and LA Waterkeeper. We'll have a brief Q&A session after each of those presentations. We'll then take a 10-minute break, and after the break, we'll be hearing from speakers 5 through 13. So with this, I will now ask Sophie and Adriana to start the LA Water Board presentation. And if I am not mistaken, I think, Iram, you have control of their slides and will be advancing them for them? Or do they need to upload them themselves?
For today,
I have it, and I'm actually going to advance it for them. So just give me the notice whenever you want me to advance Sophie and Adriana and any other participants.
Okay, okay. So Sophie, you are up.
Thank you. All right, good morning, Madam Chair, board members, and members of the public. My name is Sophie Froelich. Both Adriana Nunez and I are State Board Office of Chief Counsel Attorneys assigned to the Los Angeles Water Board to advise the board and staff on the Regional MS4 Permit. I will begin this workshop by giving you an overview of the legal background for incorporation of waste load allocations, also called WLAs, in what is known as total maximum daily loads, or TMDLs, into MS4 permits. I will then hand off the presentation to Renee Purdy, who will then explain how staff propose that TMDL WLAs should be incorporated into the tentative regional MS4 permit and the rationale for doing so. So part 1 of the presentation includes a discussion of the Clean Water Act and accompanying regulatory requirements, the NPDES, or National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System MS4 permit requirements, an overview of TMDLs, and the incorporation of TMDLs into MS4 permits. Sorry, I'm getting a little bit of feedback. If everyone can maybe mute themselves or perhaps mute their phones, that would be great. Thank you. Next slide, please. All right. So we're going to start here with a few of the Clean Water Act requirements. For each water body that is not meeting water quality standards, the CWA requires that a TMDL be established. TMDLs are composed of waste load allocations and load allocations. WLAs, or waste load allocations, are limits or permissible shares excuse me, of the pollution assigned to various sources of the pollutant, and they are defined as water quality-based effluent limitations, or WQBELS, in the federal regulations. MS4s are point sources, which are assigned TMDL WLAs if they are identified as a source of pollutant loading to a particular water body or water segment in TMDLs. TMDLs are not self-executing nor directly enforceable on their own. Therefore, if MS4s have WLAs assigned to them in TMDLs, the WLAs must be incorporated into the NPDES permits in order to be enforceable. Accordingly, at the time that this region developed the 2010 Ventura permit, the 2012 LA permit, and the 2014 Long Beach permit, TMDL WLAs for MS4s were included as WQBELs in those permits. Next slide, please. So under Section 402P3B of the Clean Water Act, MS4 permits shall effectively prohibit non-stormwater discharges, include controls to reduce the discharge of pollutants to the maximum extent possible, and that's MEP, and include such other provisions that the permitting agency determines appropriate for the control of such pollutants. Next slide, please. So pursuant to Clean Water Act Section 402P3B, the NPDES permit system provides a two-step process for establishing effluent limitations in MS4 permits. The first step is to include controls to reduce the discharge of pollutants to the maximum extent practicable. The MEP standard is analogous to a technology-based effluent limitation, also known as a TBEL, in that its reference point is the MS4 discharge rather than the waterway. Neither Congress nor US EPA has provided a precise definition of MEP. As the first step in pollutant control and establishing effluent limitations in MS4 permits, MEP functions as the regulatory floor. Next slide, please. The second step in establishing effluent limitations for MS4 NPDES permits is to determine whether there are any other provisions appropriate for the control of pollutants discharged from MS4s. EPA has stated that where the NPDES permitting authority determines that MS4 discharges have the reasonable potential to cause or contribute to a water quality standard exceedance, the permitting authority should exercise its discretion to include the necessary requirements to meet water quality standards. Federal law authorizes MS4 NPDES permits to require compliance with WQS or water quality standards when appropriate. Many water bodies in Region 4 do not meet applicable WQS, indicating that MEP alone has not been sufficient, and therefore other provisions are indeed appropriate to include. Furthermore, the State Board has determined that MS4 permits must require compliance with water quality standards in two precedential orders. Those are 9905 and 2015-0075. Next slide, please. So here in Region 4, as I'm sure you remember, we have 45 TMDLs, and there are more in the pipeline. The TMDLs identify MS4s as point sources of pollution and assign WLAs to MS4s based on a rigorous quantitative analysis. Once a TMDL is established, federal regulations require that all NPDES permits contain WQBELS consistent with the assumptions and the requirements of the TMDL WLAs. In the preamble to its Phase 1 stormwater regulations, EPA elaborated on these requirements, stating that the permits for discharges from MS4s must require controls to reduce the discharge of pollutants to the maximum extent practicable, and where necessary, include water quality-based controls. Establishing the TMDL and assigning the WLA to the MS4 makes the TMDL WLA a necessary WQBEL, or water quality-based effluent limitation, designed to achieve water quality standards. Next slide, please. So TMDL WLAs or WQBELs, like I just mentioned. There are three ways to incorporate these WQBELs into MS4 permits. First, as numeric effluent limitations. Second, as a, quote, measurable, objective BMP-based limit that is projected to achieve the waste load allocation. And three, as a combination of NELs and BMPs used to achieve TMDLs. Among other ways and other places, the first two ways to include WLAs as WQBELs in permits are specifically identified in US EPA 2014 guidance, and the last approach has been allowed specifically by US EPA and the State Water Board. But in all cases, and no matter how they are incorporated, the WQBELs must be consistent with the assumptions and requirements of the TMDL WLAs for the MS4. Next slide, please. So turning first to the incorporation of WQBELs as narrative effluent limitations expressed as BMPs. Federal regulations indicate that BMPs can be used in MS4 permits and also where it is infeasible to develop numeric effluent limitations. EPA guidance explains that where BMPs are used, they must be clear, specific, measurable, and they imply that they must be enforceable. As such, the administrative record needs to provide an adequate demonstration that where a BMP-based approach to permit limitations is selected, the BMPs required by the permit will be sufficient to implement applicable WLAs in the TMDLs. One way to do that might be through a reasonable assurance analysis or RAA. Next slide, please. So turning next to numeric WQBELS, the question is, when should we use numeric water quality-based effluent limitations in MS4 permits? So both federal regulations and US EPA guidance indicate that numeric WQBELs should be used when they are feasible to calculate and when the facts show that they are appropriate and/or necessary to achieve water quality standards. When determining whether the NELs are feasible or appropriate or necessary, it is helpful to look to the guidance issued by US EPA between 1996 and 2014. The guidance reflects US EPA's and states' expectations and experience gained over more than 20 years of implementing MS4 permits, and it reflects an evolution in the approach to MS4 permitting. In 1996 and 2002, US EPA initially emphasized a BMP-based approach to achieving water quality standards in the first few iterations of MS4 permits. While acknowledging that a numeric WQBEL approach was also acceptable, the BMP approach has evolved over time in later iterations of the guidance. Again, EPA continues to support the use of BMPs in its 2010 and 2014 guidance, but it places a much greater emphasis on clear, specific, and measurable permit requirements, and where feasible, numeric effluent limitations in NPDES permits for stormwater discharge to help restore impaired waters to their beneficial uses. During the hearing on the 2012 permit for Los Angeles County, EPA Representative John Kemmerer testified that the term feasible was to say that it is feasible to translate the WLAs into numeric effluent limitations. EPA based its 2014 guidance conclusions on the following findings. Since 2002, states and EPA have obtained considerable experience in developing TMDLs and WLAs that address stormwater sources. Monitoring of stormwater impacts on water quality have become more sophisticated and widespread. Experience gained during this time, and by that I mean from 1996 to 2014, has provided better information on the effectiveness of stormwater controls to reduce pollutant loadings and address water quality impairments. In many parts of the country, permitting agencies have issued several rounds of stormwater permits, and still, stormwater discharges remain a significant cause of water quality impairment. Next slide, please. So turning to the third approach, incorporating WLAs as a combination of both BMPs and NELs, this is what staff proposed in the tentative Regional MS4 Permit. This approach is in line with the most current US EPA 2014 guidance and was already upheld by the 2015 State Board Order. The proposed factual findings in the tentative Regional MS4 Permit here support this approach, as Ms. Purdy will explain. Ms. Purdy?
Thank you so much, Sophie. So good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for joining. It's great to see that we have a large attendance today. I see we're up to 131 participants. In the next 4 slides, what I'm going to do, Ivar, could you please go to the next slide? The one after this one. I'm going to go ahead and proceed And if you can advance the slide when you have a chance, that would be great.
Sure, because it seems to be frozen. I apologize.
That's okay, don't worry about it, I'll continue. So in the next 4 slides, I'm going to walk through the considerations we made when drafting the tentative regional MS4 permits, TMDL, and related watershed management program provisions. Our recommendations are based on the law, regulations, and guidance that Sophie just presented, the facts and circumstances within the Los Angeles region, and also permittee and stakeholder input. So paralleling her presentation regarding the 3 ways to incorporate water quality-based effluent limitations in MS4 permits, I'll first take you through our evaluation of a numeric WQBEL approach, then our evaluation of a BMP approach, and finally our recommended hybrid approach, which includes both numeric WQBELs and BMPs. Could you go to the next slide, Ivar? Thank you. So first, based on the circumstances and facts in the Los Angeles region, the board has previously determined that numeric WQBELs are necessary, and there are several reasons for this. First, a BMP-only approach, which was largely employed in the region's early generation MS4 permits, has not been effective in addressing water quality impairments due to MS4 discharges. This is evidenced by the continued impairment of water bodies in both Los Angeles and Ventura counties, and these impairments are discussed in the MS4 monitoring data report that we released in July, as well as in Section 2E of the tentative permits fact sheet. To address these impairments, the Regional Board and US EPA, as Sophie said, have established 45 TMDLs that assign wasteload allocations to MS4 discharges. Given the inadequacy of BMP-based requirements in early permits, the continued water quality impairments, and these MS4 wasteload allocations, numeric WQBELs are needed to ensure that the BMPs that are selected, designed, and maintained are designed in such a way to achieve specific water quality outcomes. The failure of BMPs in these early generation permits was discussed by a Stormwater Blue Ribbon panel in a 2006 report, which acknowledged that there was a lack of incentives and accountability regarding the need to implement BMPs that would achieve specific water quality results. The inclusion of numeric WQBELs is also consistent with the evolution of the permitting approach for MS4 discharges described by US EPA in its 1996 policy and also subsequent memos from 2002, 2010, and 2014. So staff has recommended continuing to include numeric WQBELs because the circumstances and the facts have not changed since the board's previous determination on this issue. Next slide, please. Second, we've determined that adequate information and analysis exists through the TMDL development process to calculate numeric WQBELs. In other words, they're feasible. TMDL development entails a source analysis, a linkage analysis between the applicable water quality standard and the pollutant allocations, and that's typically done using predictive water quality models or empirical relationships, and also accounts for seasonal variations and critical conditions. This analysis supports the expression of WQBELs numerically. Expressing wasteload allocations as numeric WQBELs, given these circumstances, is also consistent with EPA's 1996 policy and 2014 memo. I also note that the WQBELs in the tentative permit are expressed consistent with the numeric expression of the wasteload allocations. For example, they consider where compliance is intended to be measured. It also addresses averaging periods that are set forth in the TMDLs, as well as considerations regarding the use of acute versus chronic pollutant thresholds. And they are also consistent with the implementation language in the TMDLs about how the wasteload allocations will be incorporated into permits. Next slide, please. Staff also considered a BMP-based approach to incorporation of WQBELs, either by specifying BMPs in the permit or requiring permittees to develop essentially BMP plans to attain the wastewater allocations. We applied the criteria in 40 CFR 122.44K with regard to the use of BMPs and permits, and the guidance in the 1996 Federal Policy Statement and 2014 EPA memo. First, we looked to see if the calculation of numeric WQBELS was feasible. And as I discussed in the previous slide, based on the rigorous analysis underpinning the TMDLs, the calculation of numeric WQBELS is feasible and has already been completed. Second, we examined the evidence in the record to see if BMPs would meet the wastewater allocations. For Ventura County, we don't have information in the record in the form of, for example, watershed management programs and associated reasonable assurance analyses to support the use of BMPs to achieve the wastewater allocations. For many TMDLs in Ventura County, permittees have prepared implementation plans that identify their approach to attaining wastewater allocations, and these are a good start, but they are not detailed enough in their quantitative analysis to provide reasonable assurance that the proposed BMPs will achieve the wastewater allocations. For LA County, we do have information in the record that predicts the ability of BMPs to attain wastewater allocations through reasonable assurance analyses. However, there is still some uncertainty about the ability of these initial REAs, which were first done in about 2015 and 2016, to ensure that BMPs will attain the water quality-based effluent limitations. For example, State Board, in its 2015 order, required permittees to update their reasonable assurance analysis in 2021 based on new data. And recently, the second proposed order on 9 watershed management programs and 1 enhanced watershed management program expressed concern that the watershed management programs are not sufficiently rigorous, accountable, or transparent yet. Therefore, staff recommends that reliance on BMP-based WQBELS alone is not sufficient to fulfill some of the key criteria for incorporating wastewater allocations in the permit. For BMP-based WQBELS, staff also considered permittees' need and desire for flexibility in BMP selection. Incorporating BMP-based water quality effluent limitations in the permit, if there was evidence in the record to support it, would limit the ability of permittees to tailor their BMPs to their geography, their land use, and community preferences. Procedurally, it would also constrain the process of modifying the selection of BMPs over the course of lengthy implementation periods. Next slide, please. Thank you. After evaluating both of these approaches, what we've done is recommended permit provisions which incorporate both. The tentative permit includes numeric WQBELS, which staff believes are necessary, feasible, and consistent with the TMDL wastewater allocations. Staff has also recommended an alternative compliance pathway in the form of BMP-based requirements in watershed management programs. Through these proposed permit provisions, permittees have the flexibility to select, design, and implement a tailored suite of BMPs. These BMPs must be supported by a reasonable assurance analysis that demonstrates that the BMPs are projected to achieve the wastewater allocations, and permittees must commit to milestones to track BMP progress. These provisions allow permittees to collaborate and cost share on a watershed basis, and they provide permittees with greater compliance certainty during implementation. Numeric WQBELS are a backstop if if BMPs aren't implemented, and they serve as insurance that final water quality outcomes will be achieved. Staff believes that this approach provides the greatest flexibility to permittees to comply with the TMDL provisions in the permit while being consistent with federal law, regulation, and guidance, considering the specific facts in the Los Angeles region. This approach is also supported by the State Board in its 2015 order on the 2012 LA County MS4 permit. And that concludes our staff presentation, and I think now we will pause for a few minutes to take any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Renee. Yes, we will now have a brief Q&A session. We will allow, so if the board members have any questions, we will prioritize, go to them first, and then we will address participants' questions that have been submitted through the Q&A feature. So would board members like to ask any questions of staff?
And I was searching for my raise hand feature. It's at the very bottom of your participant list if you're struggling to find where that is. Though I will also see if I see your real hand raised as well.
Just to be efficient, I don't have any questions. That was very informative. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Board Member Stringer.
Renee, I can't find my raised hand. Excuse
me. That's okay. Your voice works well too.
I do have a number of questions, but I would like to. We have a time for the board members to discuss the issues, but I would like to hear from the speakers that have signed up, because I think it is important to be able to get their input as a factor in our discussion.
Yes, and that is certainly the intention, and we will have some Q&A opportunities after the speakers, as Iram explained, as well as discussion time at the end. But we did want to just make sure that if there's any particularly pressing questions, if you need clarification or we weren't clear about something, and the same goes for the speakers that you'll hear from next, this is your opportunity to ask any of those clarifying questions at this point, just so you don't have to try to keep track of all of them until the end.
It's not necessarily a question, but just a comment. I do appreciate very much the staff presentation and the amount of work that you've not only put into this, but all of the documents that we've seen. Sophie had made the comment about the fact that across the United States, there had been problems with compliance based upon BMPs in terms of stormwater. And I think, yes, there have been problems, but I think what we have to be really careful is that most of those problems are associated with combined sewers. And the situation in Los Angeles County and in our permit is not with combined sewers, but with separate sewers. So I think that there is a big difference in terms of the applicability and success of BMPs and being able to calculate waste load allocations on a combined sewer as opposed to separate. So it's more of an observation on my part, but again, I certainly want to hear from the public.
Thank you, Board Member Stahl. And I would like to just clarify, because I think you make some good points about distinctions between, of course, combined sewer systems and separate systems, where we are fortunate in a way to have our systems separate. I used to live in Boston where they have combined systems. And to your point about BMPs, what the problem has been, I think BMPs have the potential to be effective, but as I said in my remarks about particularly the stormwater blue ribbon panel that had been established by the water boards back in the mid-2000s, what that panel found is that BMPs for MS4 discharges and for other types of stormwater discharges, not combined sewers, but just stormwater discharges, were really not being designed with water quality outcomes in mind. And so that is largely why in the early generation permits, BMPs have not been as effective, because they weren't selected, cited, designed, and maintained with an eye towards achieving specific water quality results. They have the potential to be effective, and I think that is where our reasonable assurance analysis comes in, which basically looks at a suite of BMPs and looks to see what those BMPs need to be, where they need to be put, how they need to be designed so that they can be effective at the end of the day in achieving the water quality outcomes that we're looking for. So that is really what we're trying to say about BMPs, is it's not that they don't have the potential to be effective, But in the past, in our early generation permits, they were not designed with, for example, water quality standards and achieving water quality standards in mind. And the process that we established with the reasonable assurance analyses now makes it possible to ensure that we're designing them in a way that we know will be effective at achieving the WQBELS and the receiving water limitations that are in the permit.
Renee, I appreciate those remarks, because I was going to say that 2006, when the panel came up with that recommendation, we're 14 years later, and the technology has significantly improved from the standpoint of being able to show how BMPs through modeling or through actual practice can achieve water quality based limits, or can achieve the improvements in water quality that we'd all like to see. So I just want to be sure that it's clear to the public, at least, that we're not making a decision or going down a path here based upon a judgment that was made in 2006, and here we are in 2020. And enough said, because I don't want to take time away from hearing from the speakers.
It looks like Rebecca has a list of some questions she might want to go over.
Yes, we received 2 questions. I'll read out them in the order received. We have a question that asks, what does numeric WQBELS at the end of the implementation period mean as a practical matter? Renee, would you like to take that question?
Certainly, I'd be happy to. So what that means, this is similar to really the same as how the current MS4 permit operates, meaning that once the end of the TMDL implementation period arrives, meaning the final compliance date, then permittees need to demonstrate through monitoring at outfalls in the receiving water that the final numeric WQBELs are being achieved. And the permit, the current permits as well as the tentative permit, which we released at the end of August, allows a demonstration of compliance either at outfalls, meaning the MS4 discharge points, or in the receiving water. But essentially, that is what we mean by the numeric WQBELs ensure that the water quality outcomes are achieved at the end of the TMDL implementation period. Monitoring data at that point needs to show that those numbers are in fact achieved in the receiving water or at the outfall.
Thank you, Renee. Our next question says, can you summarize how this approach to TMDL Incorporation is different from the 2012 LA County permit?
So yes, I will take that question as well. I'm assuming you're punting that one over to me. So it is not different. The approach that we are proposing is the same as what is currently in the LA County 2012 permit.
I saw that, oh, Chair Munoz had her hand raised, and now I see that Vice Chair Yee has his hand raised.
I'll defer to the Vice Chair and then I'll ask my question.
Okay.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So it's still early, so I'll just ask a simple question first, and then my second question is a little bit more, and we could probably wait till later to answer it. But my first question is, of the 3 different pathways to compliance, how many of our permittees are choosing numeric or BMP or the hybrid approach?
So one thing that I will clarify is at this point in the current 3 permits that are in place now, which this regional permit would replace, the LA County and City of Long Beach permits are the ones that have this approach that is the hybrid approach of the watershed management program. The Ventura County permit does not have the option for developing a watershed management program and demonstrating compliance during the period of implementation through a watershed management program with BMPs. So of the permittees in Los Angeles County, all but 4 permittees have opted for the hybrid approach, where they have chosen to develop a watershed management program. Of course, we had what we called watershed management programs and enhanced programs. We are consolidating those into just a single a type of program that we're calling a watershed management program. But all but 4 within Los Angeles County are opting for the hybrid approach.
Okay, thank you. And then my second question has to do with the maximum extent practicable. And I'm reading this from page 115 of the fact sheet as it starts to explain the concept. And it says, rather, the MEP standard is an ever-evolving, flexible, and advancing concept, which considers technical and economic feasibility. So I completely understand that, this is ever-evolving and meant to be flexible. And I was listening carefully to Sophie's presentation, where I think she, talked a fair amount about technical feasibility, but I didn't hear much about economic feasibility. And I don't know if you want to get into that now or later, but I just want to raise that. Thank you.
Okay. And I don't know, Sophie, if you'd like to respond. I mean, I could start initially and we could continue the conversation during the discussion period. But I do want to make, one distinction, which I know you heard in Sophie's presentation, Vice Chair Yee, which is that the MEP standard, which is the technology-based standard, is distinct from the water quality-based effluent limitations, which we are really focusing on here during this workshop. But that said, the MEP standard does include economic considerations. So separate from the water quality-based effluent limitations and incorporation of TMDLs that we're discussing now, while I think as Sophie pointed out, the MEP is not specifically defined in federal regulations, but there is information that we have over the years been able to draw upon that has allowed us in California to develop somewhat of a definition of MEP for a technology-based standard for MS4 permits. And it does include an economic component or economic feasibility consideration as part of that. Sophie, would you like to add more to what I said?
I think that the only thing I would like to add, well, first of all, I'm going to call on my co-counsel, Adriana Nunez, to assist in answering questions. We did work on this presentation together. I was just the lucky one who was elected to give it. But I will point out that costs cannot be used as a matter of law to override requirements of the Clean Water Act. And the Clean Water Act also requires that we must comply with water quality standards. Those two things are in tension in the Clean Water Act, but the Supreme Court in the Burbank case had made it quite clear that we cannot avoid putting in controls that will establish or attain water quality standards. Adriana?
I don't have anything to add. I think Board Member Yee, your question, I think, sort of touches on some of what you'll be hearing from some of the stakeholders today, where they bring up economic feasibility. In part, that's because some stakeholders assert that MEP is the only standard that can or should apply to MS4 permits. And as Sophie so nicely laid out in her presentation, that's a fundamental disagreement, a point for us.
Okay, thank you very much. I look forward to our continuing discussion this morning.
Yeah. And I would.
This really concludes the end of our Q&A, Renee. If you don't mind me cutting you off, we've got a really tight schedule today and we want to move on to the next speaker. We will have more opportunity for Q&A and we do have about 45 minutes set aside at the end of the meeting for the board members to discuss.
No worries. I was going to cut myself off and say we should move on.
Thank you. So our next speaker is Arnie Ansel with the Ventura County. You have 15 minutes for your presentation.
All right, thank you. Munoz board members, my name is Arnie Anselm, Ventura County Public Works, representing all the cities of Ventura County, and we do have concerns and an alternative to share on how the TMDLs are incorporated in the permit. First, thank you for having this workshop. Looks like you are treating it as a workshop. That's what our hope was. Please ask questions at the end. Hope you don't wait till 3 hours from now. We definitely have more detail and rationale, but I can't get into it in the 15 minutes I have. Next slide, please. The 2012 permit was groundbreaking, but since then, numerous other approaches to incorporating TMDLs have been used, both in California and in other regions. These alternatives may be more effective at achieving your board's goals. We hope to use this workshop to consider your goals for the permit and your goals for the region, and whether other approaches might be more effective in achieving those goals. Next slide. Before we get into potential alternatives, we must first express our concerns with the TMDLs as they are presented in the draft tentative permit. Generally speaking, at the final TMDL numeric water quality-based effluent method of translating waste load allocations to water quality-based effluent limits has not yet been determined for stormwater as it has for wastewater. Stormwater is much more challenging to control. Many of the adopted TMDLs were explicit in stating waste load allocations for MS4s would be incorporated as BMPs, not numeric WQBELs. Assessing compliance with numeric WQBELs sounds straightforward, but there are challenges, and the permit does not incentivize collaborative watershed planning, particularly with other dischargers, which makes obtaining the needed funding much more difficult. And the TMDL schedules are problematic because there was no real planning effort behind them, and they don't reflect the realities of implementation, especially everything learned since the TMDLs were developed. Next slide, please. Developing WQBELs from the waste load allocation requires additional consideration. State and EPA guidance on turning waste load allocations into effluent limitations considers more than calculating a number. It includes factors like variability, duration, and that guidance was designed for wastewater and other continuous one-pipe dischargers. For stormwater, guidance does not exist. And those factors, variability, dilution, duration, are accentuated in stormwater flows. We simply disagree with staff's statement that development of WQBELs is appropriate where feasible to calculate. The state's 2006 Blue Ribbon Panel on the Development of Quantitative Measurements for Stormwater, earlier referenced by Renee, found that numeric effluent criteria for municipal BMPs and urban discharges are not feasible. Let me give you a quick example why. Pretend a city drains to a single outfall. That discharge has a pollutant of 10 milligrams per liter. To reduce the pollutant, the city builds an infiltration basin. Diverts a portion of the flow to it. Water that doesn't get diverted, it still has 10 milligrams per liter. Monitoring at the outfall will still show 10 milligrams per liter. All the money spent on that BMP and all the pollutants removed will have done nothing to help with compliance with the numeric water quality-based effluent limit. So a significant amount of work needs to be done before we can take a step to translate waste load allocation to water quality-based effluent limits. Next slide, please. There are other reasons why WQBELs create compliance concerns. The Santa Clara River once had a problem with nitrogen. It was put on the 303D list. The TMDL adopted. POTWs eliminated their discharge. It was a success. Nitrogen compounds were delisted. But that TMDL with water quality-based effluent limits for a delisted water body is in the draft tentative, and the draft tentative does not allow any exceedances. This chart is, I think, over 10 years of monitoring. And it brings up the questions, are MS4s considered out of compliance when data demonstrates beneficial use is attained? Does a single exceedance of a water quality-based effluent limit constitute an MS4 as out of compliance, even when objectives allow some exceedances, and water bodies can be delisted even when there are some exceedances? In this case, WQBELs will focus efforts, money, on a water body no longer impaired and creates a risk of mandatory minimum penalties. Next slide, please. The effort to meet water quality-based effluent limits on the schedules included in the draft tentative will drive control measures, will drive a selection of control measures to provide the highest level of certainty, not the most bang for the buck. A few projects can provide substantial load reduction, but the remaining load reduction will incur significant additional costs, causing project costs to soar beyond the point of diminishing returns. The majority of costs are going to be chasing that final bit to meet a numeric water quality-based effluent limit. These graphs are showing the cost of compliance with the Santa Clara River bacteria TMDL. The implementation plan identified BMPs for each MS4, with the remaining load reduction done through green streets. The smaller graph on the right shows the cost of green streets compared to other BMPs. They are expensive. The larger graph shows the load reduction by costs and by BMP type. You can see 90% of the cost of compliance will be to get less than 40% of the load. And the permittees would still be out of compliance if water quality is not met at the end of the TMDL schedule. Next slide, please. Water management plans in the draft tentative permit are not at the watershed scale. They are at the MS4 scale, and this creates costly impacts to the MS4s. Watershed management plans must show through reasonable assurance analysis control measures will meet WQBELS for MS4 discharges alone, with no accounting for reductions from other sources. These graphs show how a greater reduction is required by the MS4 if the watershed does not work together. The timing of reductions from other sources of pollutants are not in sync. For example, some of the TMDL deadlines have been extended for Ventura County agricultural dischargers, but not MS4. While the watershed is making progress on attaining beneficial use, the MS4s will unnecessarily need to go above and beyond to meet their water quality-based effluent limits. This approach also disincentivizes control measures that are harder to quantify, such as restoration, particularly if permittees are held to ensuring that load reductions are attained. So to summarize our concerns, watershed planning needs to be broad and not focused only on MS4s, particularly in Ventura County where we have multiple sources. And by including WQBELS, TMDLs become the focus of the program, potentially losing sight of other factors and can drive significant costs. Next slide, please. So we have alternatives. To address these concerns, we prepared an alternative where we considered the feedback from the regional board, the NGOs, and our permittees. And as a result, we saw that it's imperative that compliance with the alternative is clear, both to the permittees and to the public on how they assess whether permittees are in compliance. At the same time, we need to recognize that stormwater is different from continuous point source dischargers like wastewater and can't be regulated in the same way. We need a process that recognizes all the factors that influence stormwater quality, how it's monitored, how projects are funded, and that still makes progress improving water quality at a pace acceptable to stakeholders and your board. Also important to us is alignment with other efforts such as the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, SGMA, California's Water Resiliency Portfolio, the National Water Reuse Plan, and the governor's new 30 by 30 executive order. All of these emphasize adaptability, coordination, and thinking differently to address a wider range of issues with limited funding. So here's our alternative. Next slide, please. In short, we would prefer to remove WQBELS, at least for Ventura, until we can determine what is best for the region. Now, understanding that that might not be realistic, we have an alternative proposal consistent with language from the permit in 3 points. Watershed management plans become WQBELS once approved. So this fits the BMP model. BMP WQBELS versus numeric WQBELS. Compliance language is modified to align with impairment assessments, and a prioritized list of control measures can establish alternative compliance schedules for TMDL compliance. We believe our approach is consistent with the guidance and regulations explained by your staff. Next slide, please. So we propose that the watershed management plan, once approved, replaces final WQBELS for the TMDLs designated in the plan. This is consistent with language from existing permits in San Bernardino and Riverside that's shown on this slide. And we would require adaptive management and use of monitoring data to assess if updates are needed. And if implementation does not meet it does not end if water quality is not met. And the plan and any revisions are to be approved by your board in a public process. Next slide, please. These simple language changes are to address the example of Santa Clara River nitrogen. It allows for intermittent exceedances if not impacting beneficial uses, and makes it clear permittees are in compliance if a water body has been delisted and there is no longer an impairment. This reduces costs by keeping the pollutants out of the watershed management plan, particularly given the potential RAA requirements coming from the state board order. Next slide, please. Although those first two parts help, they will not address the unattainable TMDL schedules. We see a solution using the Caltrans permit as a model. The left side has language from Caltrans, and the right side is a list of the key points to the changes. We would require multiple changes throughout the permit to make this happen, and we will provide that language. The approach is to establish a pace of BMP implementation within the watershed management plans with clear compliance metrics for the control measures that will be implemented in the permit. With this change, not all TMDL schedules will be met, but permittees are considered in compliance if approved BMPs are implemented. And watershed management plan schedule becomes the new TMDL compliance schedule for the permit. This provides a clear compliance mechanism that meets EPA requirements for incorporating TMDLs. It supports development of more cost-effective watershed management plans that can align with other programs such as capital improvement plans, and allows watershed management plans to be developed based on implementing the best project over a time frame that aligns with available funding rather than being driven by an artificial TMDL deadline. So next slide, please. So in summary, we really encourage a robust discussion about this issue. Hopefully, you now better understand the significant impacts this policy decision has on costs and how Ventura County will plan for compliance with this permit. We also hope you understand that you have options. These are a few examples. Our letter outlined many more from other permits in California and the EPA compendium of options from around the country. We hope you now have an understanding that there are alternatives. We have evidence in Ventura County this approach works based on improvements to water quality seen under the BMP-based compliance approach in the current permit. The addition of watershed management plans and reasonable assurance analysis will provide additional assurance that water quality improvements will be made. And we have more information now on BMP effectiveness than we did in 2012 that should provide more comfort assurance that water quality improvements will occur. Finally, this approach is easily explained to decision makers and the public to support obtaining funding. Here's my required part of every presentation. We do not, in Ventura County, have Measure W level of funding. We need to do what we can to get a permit that will support us going to the public and getting the funding we need. This approach also supports more streamlined compliance reporting that is more accessible to the public and requires continued improvement in water quality by MS4s until TMDL waste load allocations and receiving water objectives are met through the adaptive management program. Okay, so thank you again for having this workshop. I hope we can have a good detailed discussion. I have professional help available to answer any really difficult questions. If I can phone a friend, I hope you ask these questions. I think a long string of presentation followed by your board's discussion is not what we envisioned. So I hope we can have a robust or detailed conversation right now. And I hope you now have an understanding that there are alternatives that your board can use this forum or another one to examine what policy choice regarding TMDLs is the best to support the region in addressing these complex challenges. Thank you.
Thank you, Arnie. We'll now have another short Q&A period. I think this time we would like to recognize Chair Munoz, since you did not get a chance to speak previously.
Thank you. Let me look up my question that I had. It has to do with tracking. I think it was Renee who said that the permits must include milestones to track BMP implementation progress. I guess that's the question I always have is how do we track? How often do we track? And is our tracking consistent? And has it been successful based on previous models that we use tracking?
had my video on, but not my sound on. Thank you, Chair Munoz. And if everybody who's not speaking could please mute themselves, that would be appreciated. So yes, I mentioned the need for milestones to track BMP progress if a BMP-based WQBEL approach was taken. And so essentially the way that we've done that in the current permit in LA County and also the City of Long Beach's permit under the watershed management programs is those programs have milestones for BMP implementation, which are required to be met for the permittees to maintain that alternative compliance pathway of demonstrating compliance using BMPs. And so what happens is permittees report on those milestones during their annual report. So they're required to submit an annual report each year, and they report on their progress implementing those BMPs during that annual reporting process. They would also, so similarly, they would also report on milestones if milestones were to be included in the permit itself, BMP-based milestones. They would also report on those milestones that are in the permit also through their annual reporting. So annual reporting is really how we track milestones, and currently in the current permits, it's through the watershed management programs that we establish those milestones. Chair Munoz, you're on mute. And unfortunately, because I'm not the host, I can't unmute you.
I just unmuted
Thank
myself.
you, Renee. One quick announcement before we move on to Board Member Stahl. We will not be participating in the 10:15 California Shakeout. Unfortunately, due to our tight schedule agenda, we just cannot participate. So I would just want to make that announcement.
Big shakeup. I do have one little question, if I can still continue.
Yes.
Okay. I said this last time, and I'm going to repeat myself because I think it's worth repeating. Every time I hear Mr. Anselm speak, he just makes more sense to me. And one thing that he always talks about is that they don't have Measure W. And for LA County, Measure W for its permittees has been a game changer. And I know that I've talked to Renee about this. It seems to me that the county has been very thoughtful and pretty thorough on how they can achieve compliance. What parts of his presentation that he just gave us Renee, do you agree with, or do you think that we can consider in including in our permit? Because I think he was very logical about every step. And you know, when someone presents something like that to us, I feel that we have to pay attention. So can you possibly comment on his presentation, please?
Yes, I can. And I will call on others to possibly assist me with some of my response as well. So I would start by saying that the general approach of making watershed management programs a part of the MS4 permit is something that we have thought about and I think could potentially be an option. As I mentioned in my presentation, the things that we considered when thinking about that as an option is by making watershed management programs essentially a part of the permit requirements. It creates a situation where there is less flexibility to change those programs over time, in that procedurally, those programs then for every change would need to come back to the board for changes, because they would become a part of the permit. Making permit decisions is not an action that is able to be delegated to the executive officer. So these are lengthy, complicated programs, complex, I should say, maybe not complicated, but complex programs that are going to be going on for decades. And they will change over time. We have experience to see that in LA County, there is a need sometimes to change them. We all agree we don't want to necessarily have to change them to the degree that some watershed management programs have had to in Los Angeles County, but invariably there will be changes that will be needed. That being said, it is an option that we could think about. The issue right now is that we do not have watershed management programs in Ventura County with the supporting reasonable assurance analysis that gives us enough confidence to know that a certain set of BMPs will achieve the waste load allocations for the TMDLs that are applicable to Ventura County permittees. That work can be done, and that is the way that the tentative regional permit is laid out, is to allow the time for Ventura County permittees, just like LA did, to develop watershed management programs and the supporting reasonable assurance analyses. So I think that that is something we could consider. I believe what Arnie is suggesting is, it sounded like once those are done, reopening the permit to replace the water quality based effluent limits expressed numerically with the approved watershed management programs. I believe that's, and he's frowning, so maybe I didn't quite get it right because he still has his video on. So, so I'll let him correct my understanding if that's not correct. But you know, putting the watershed management programs in is something that we could potentially consider. I do want to clarify something though, with regard to a couple things with regard to his proposal. First, I do want to clarify that the current Ventura County MS4 permit has water quality-based effluent limitations in it. And if you look at the findings of the current permit, you'll see that that is the case. And as Sophie said, a waste load allocation is a type of water quality-based effluent limitation. So those are currently in the Ventura permit to implement the TMDLs that are applicable in the Ventura watersheds. So I do want to clarify that, because it seems like there is a possible disagreement or misunderstanding that there are not water quality based effluent limitations in the Ventura permit currently, but that is not the case. There are the waste load allocations, which are in the Ventura County permit, are WQBELs. They are expressed in the permit numerically. The permit does say that BMPs will be implemented to achieve those waste load allocations, but that is different from how compliance is demonstrated with the waste load allocations. So I just want to clarify that. It seems to be a continuing point of, like I said, disagreement and is, I think, creating some confusion. So I realize I didn't respond to every part of Arnie's proposal. I think that the other thing that I would say with regard to, well, two more things perhaps. One is that when he was talking about concerns that the current approach would discourage collaboration and not allow MS4 permittees, the cities in Ventura, to work with other entities like agriculture. Really, I would say the watershed management programs are designed to allow the opportunity to do that. And I think that we need to talk with Ventura County permittees to determine how best that can happen. But it is not watershed management programs to discourage collaboration among other partners. And if you look at, for example, the LA County permit, currently, we even talk about collaboration and cooperation with other partners, not just MS4 permittees. So it is not the intent to discourage that. And I think that we can make sure that there's a way to accommodate that. And the way to accommodate that could be that if it's warranted, to look at compliance schedules for TMDLs in Ventura County. We have not started that process for Ventura County yet, with the exception of TMDLs in Malibu. And Malibu is on the border, so it falls in both counties. But I think that that's where perhaps we would be able to think about how to make sure that we're not discouraging collaboration among other groups of dischargers like agriculture and others within Ventura County. I think I touched on a number of the things that he brought up in his proposal, but perhaps not everything.
It's a good, thorough response. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, I'm happy for anybody else on the regional board side to jump in if you feel as though I've missed something. And Arnie, I do feel as though you need to clarify something that I said. We should give you the opportunity to clarify your proposal as well.
Sorry if I was frowning. It surprised me about reopening the permit to approve the watershed management plans. I don't think that that's necessary. I think watershed management plans can be approved through a public process going to the board without the permit being a part of that.
Oh, well, what I was saying, I understood your proposal to be that the watershed management programs would essentially become permit provisions. And so perhaps there could still be a public process to approve the watershed management program, but then a second process during which the board would consider then making that approved program actually an enforceable set of permit requirements.
Okay. Getting into the bureaucratic details I'm not prepared for.
Well, we can certainly have an additional conversation after this workshop. And I see, Rebecca, I did see Board Member Stringer had his actual hand up, and maybe there were a couple others, I don't know.
We have two hands up, Board Member Stringer and Board Member Stahl. If you would like to continue speaking, that isn't a problem, but then we will skip the Q&A after the next speaker. So, because we're about 5 minutes behind schedule, so we can continue talking, but I will skip the next Q&A after the next speaker to try to catch us up. Your choice.
Maybe we can combine the Q&A after the next two speakers and skip the one in between. That sounds good.
Right.
Yeah, I don't want to cut this short.
Yeah, it feels important to me. Just a question, maybe for the county. I'm just trying to think through the enforcement implications of the approach that you're suggesting. And maybe you can help me think that through.
Well,
I would say that. Oh, Arnie, you asked Arnie. I'm sorry, be quiet.
Yeah, I'd like to hear from Arnie if that's okay, and then staff can reflect on it as well. But I'm just trying to work it over in my own mind, and I'm a little bit confused. So I appreciate hearing. Thank you.
So the enforcement mechanism really I think where what you want to hear about is the plan to establish a pace of BMP implementation, and that would be the metrics of we step forward, let's say the 5-year permit term. This is what we're going to get done, and enforcement would be follow. Do we get it done? Did we make enough progress? And certainly funding plays a big part of that, and getting a funding plan together and developing that source of money. Hard to do everything without that money. If we're limited to just the funds we have, not much will get done. So I see that as a way to put metrics, compliance metrics, in the permit that everybody can understand. Not in the permit, in the plan.
Thanks. Anyone on staff have anything to add to that?
Jenny, did you want to add to that?
Well, by Arnie's answer, I'm not sure that I understood the question exactly. So, Charlie, were you asking what are the enforcement implications of incorporating WQs as BMPs instead of numerics?
Well, and just more generally, the approach, as I understand it, that's being recommended of incorporating WMPs in as, in effect as an alternative, and what the enforcement implications of that would be, and maybe that's equivalent to how you just rephrased it. So,
well, I think we see that they're both WQBELs, so they're both enforceable elements of the permit. So if the WQBEL was incorporated as a water quality management program with BMPs, the elements of that watershed management program would be enforceable.
And it's really not very different than permit provisions that were numeric effluent limits. There are, I can turn it over to our lawyers, but obviously there's certain types of violations of numeric effluent limitations that are subject to mandatory minimum penalties under state law. So there's that extra element associated with numeric effluent limits. But other than that, there's not much of a difference under federal law between incorporating WQBELS as numeric effluent limits or BMP-based narrative effluent limits.
And that's assuming that they are incorporated as permit provisions, which is what I understood, rather than the approach that we currently have with the LA County and Long Beach permits, where the watershed management programs sort of, I usually say, like, live outside of the permit, but their implementation deems a permittee in compliance with the numeric water quality based effluent limits in the permit, so long as the permittees are doing everything that they said they would do in the watershed management programs. So this is, it would be a little, I mean, I'm viewing the proposal as different in that this proposal means the BMPs actually are put in as permit requirements. They become an enforceable component of the permit, as opposed to the way that the watershed management programs operate in conjunction with, but outside of the permit itself currently.
Right.
If I could summarize that, it's the actions. We need to do the actions, and those are enforceable, not the water quality effluent limits. We maintain that schedule.
Mm-hmm.
I guess just an obvious follow-up, is it possible for the permit to have a different approach for Ventura County than LA County?
Well, it does in some cases. I mean, certainly there's some places where it has different requirements in terms of different schedule in certain cases. I think that would be possible. I think that, though, we would want to ensure that one, it was obviously consistent with our law, regulations, and guidance. We would also want to make sure that the facts and the circumstances supported a different approach in Ventura County. I think that what I am grappling with somewhat is how this is very different from the hybrid approach. And I guess it's different in that Arnie, on behalf of the Ventura County permittees, is suggesting to replace numeric WQBELS at some point with BMPs in an approved watershed management program as permit requirements. And that, so in answer, Board Member Stringer, I think it would be possible to have different requirements, but I think there would need to be a justification for why we're treating things differently in Ventura County than in Los Angeles County. And while I certainly understand the differences from the point of view of the geography, the land use, the nature of the urbanized versus non-urbanized areas, I think that our current watershed management program approach is meant to accommodate some of those differences.
And am I right to assume that the existence of Measure W in LA County and not in Ventura County is not a rational basis for a different approach?
No, I would say it's not. I mean, and not just to say that in any sort of way that appears that I'm insensitive to the cost of complying with the permit and the cost of implementing BMPs. At the time that we made the decision to use this approach in LA County did not have Measure W. And so it's, you know, and we felt it was an appropriate approach given the facts and the circumstances at the time in Los Angeles County. I think that for that reason, that is not a reason to say this would not be an appropriate approach in Ventura County. You know, we're hopeful that Ventura County over time perhaps will be able to secure more dedicated funding. I think the Ventura County permittees hope the same. And I think the way to address that, as in LA County, is where it's appropriate to consider the schedules in the TMDLs, and then what we bring into the permit as compliance schedules in consideration of some of those economic factors.
Thank you. I've been hogging the mic here, and I see Jim has his hand up, so that's enough for now. Thank you.
Rebecca, can we get one more board member question in before we move on?
Of course, board member Stahl, but I think Sophie was also waving at the camera as well. But
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate Charlie's comments. And Irma, I couldn't agree with you more from the standpoint of every time that I heard Ventura, represented by Arnie, make a presentation, that it makes a great deal of sense to me and needs to be further explored. And when I say further explored, I'm not differentiating between Ventura County and LA County. I think for the regional permit, this type of an alternative and an approach needs to be explored. I don't think that, as I read it at least, that Arnie's direction here is that much different than what the city of LA proposed in a February 18th letter that I have it in front of me here, that's why, or February 20th, I guess, my poor eyes, the city of LA and Sharam presented with regard to compliance from the standpoint of a schedule of the implementation of BMPs. I see Sharam Karagami as one of the listed speakers, I think, so he can comment on that. But I also comment quickly or ask a question of Arnie. You say you submitted a letter, and I don't know if that's the most recent one or the one that I have read that you sent in on the 16th of June, in which you had proposed something very similar to this and went so far as to say, we need to have a workshop so that we can have an attempt to have a collaborative approach that Ventura, and I say the cities in LA County can agree upon as to alternatives. So it's not a question of we're on a path that we're going to adopt the 2012 permit with upgrades, if you will, or bringing it up to date. And that's the only path we're on, because there's a lot of other paths taken by regional boards, as you pointed out in your letter, Arnie, that are different than ours. And I've always felt that you need to look at what everybody else is doing. You may wind up coming back to exactly where you are, but I think the process should entail looking at all of the other alternatives and see why they chose something different than ours. I mean, their protection of water quality in their region, I would assume and believe, is just as important to them as it is to us, and yet they took a different approach. So I go back to your letter where you had said we should have workshops that are focused on looking at these alternatives. I know we're time constrained today, but I think that that's something that I would recommend strongly to the staff and the board that we do in the future before an adoption of an MS4 regional permit for LA Ventura County. Thank you.
Thank you. As I was referring to the June letter.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Further workshops and discussion on those alternatives, I strongly support as well. If I know you're running out of time. Our proposal is
thank you. We really do need to move on to our next speaker, Mr. Travis Van Litken with Lieutenant Tucker. You have 10 minutes for your presentation.
Thank you very much. Travis Van Litken on behalf of the City of Duarte. I'd like to thank the chair and the fellow board members and regional board staff for the time to talk today on the how to incorporate these TMDLs into the permit, which I think everyone can acknowledge is one of the key issues that was litigated in the Duarte lawsuit and came out with a trial court decision in favor of Duarte, which set forth a couple of legal standards, which I'm going to address very briefly, not very briefly, but I'm going to address and how those findings and those holdings kind of directly impact how the regional board should go about actually implementing the TMDLs in this current version of the permit as well, because I think will be very informative, at least especially based off the comments I've heard today. I think this will hopefully give you a couple of other factors to consider going forward. So as an initial matter, and I was heartened to hear today that it seems that regional board staff is agreeing that whether or not the TMDLs are incorporated via a numeric WQBEL or numeric effluent limit, which is what I'm going to refer to them as, or if it's a purely BMP-based approach, wherein it's something along the lines of, I think the Ventura County permittees is putting forth, essentially, approving a suite of BMPs that can be adopted with the goal of increasing water quality over time. That decision under the Clean Water Act is an exercise of discretion that is vested within this board. Why that's important is that once we have established that it is a matter of discretion for the board, that's when state law becomes relevant to this board's inquiry. And specifically, that was one of the key issues that was litigated in the Duarte lawsuit. And frankly, there are multiple Court of Appeal decisions on the issue, both federal and state, that repeatedly affirm the fact that a public agency's decision to incorporate numeric effluent limits on a permit that's applicable to a municipal discharger under the Clean Water Act is a matter of discretion. What that means then for California is that this regional board, acting as an arm of the executive branch of our government, is then relegated to considering the factors that are required to consider under the California Water Code. And specifically what I'm talking about is the California Water Code section 13241 factors. And more particularly than the ones I'm going to talk about briefly here are 13241C and D, the first requiring the board to consider whether or not the permit terms are quote unquote reasonably achievable in light of the unique circumstances for the watershed, as well as whether or not the permit terms that are being considered and being imposed pursuant to the board's discretion is appropriate in light of, quote, what is defined as economic considerations in the Water Code, but was subsequently interpreted by the California Supreme Court to mean, quote, the discharger's cost of compliance. So what that means is when the board is, in terms of the analytical framework going forward, the factors the boards need to consider is, first, the regional board needs to actually assess and identify the potential costs of compliance with the challenge permit, not the challenge permit terms, but the permit terms being pursued. In this case, the NEL provisions that are currently in the tentative draft permit that we're looking at, which we just heard a second ago, are the same or extremely similar to those that were incorporated in the 2012 permit. Once you've identified those costs, the second issue is the regional board needs to actually conduct an analysis and have that analysis evidenced in its findings that shows that the BMP, whatever terms you decide, remember either NELs or BMP only terms, are appropriate in light of your consideration of those factors. And lastly, the facts underlying that decision ultimately have to support that decision. If you cannot make those separate, meet those separate requirements, the regional board would be committing an abuse of discretion, which would warrant a legal challenge and potentially invalidating those specific terms that were adopted in contravention of those authorities. So quickly, and indeed in prior comment letters I've submitted as well, but looking at the tentative permit as currently drafted, the current fact sheet kind of fails to address all three portions of that analysis I just said. First, while the fact sheet does purport to identify some potential costs of compliance, it does kind of omit some of the information that has been submitted by my office, and I believe others as well, that details what it would actually cost to comply with the numeric effluent limits, not just the WIMP and EWIMP provisions, or the TMDL assumptions that were previously assessed when the TMDLs were initially adopted. And so I would suggest and advise that the regional board needs to actually look at what 100% compliance with the numeric effluent limits and their related deadlines would be, and that's the metric the board has to consider going forward. Second, there still doesn't seem to be any analysis as to whether or not the permit's terms on these NEL terms in specifically are appropriate in light of those concerns, which does need to be included. And if it's not included, it would be an abuse of discretion and under Code of Civil Procedure 1094.5. And lastly, just looking at the fact sheet on its face, and I said this briefly, but it seems to admit that the cost could be as high as over $30 billion of complying with these NEL-related terms. But then at the same time, in a separate section, even including Measure W funds for the LA County permittees, mind you, there is insufficient funding to actually pay for those costs. So essentially what you're doing is setting up, as adopted, or as currently proposed, you're setting up the permittees to try to pay for a program which the regional board's acknowledging from the get-go, essentially, that they will never be able to afford. And that would mean that under those facts alone, I would argue, those facts would not support a finding of reasonable achievability or that these terms are appropriate in light of the economic considerations the board must consider. So that's my quick, and I'm sorry for going so quickly through there, and I'll be happy to answer questions on those issues. But those are my quick comments on the legal background. I wanted to kind of address some of the comments that were raised earlier today, as well as a couple comments I heard in prior board meetings, and I apologize I was not able to attend the last board meeting on the issue. But first, there was a couple of statements in the past regarding when the cost of compliance needs to be considered, whether it should be upon the adoption of the permit or whether it should be during the implementation phase specifically. And actually today I heard a couple comments saying whether or not the board is supposed to take into account costs as a justification to determine whether or not these terms are appropriate, especially in regards to the Ventura County permittees comments earlier. The short answer to that is that because these terms are discretionary, the board needs to look at those costs now. That is the short answer. The counsel for the boards during the Duarte case specifically argued that they could look at the cost of the cost wall in the implementation phase, and that was a finding that was previously included in the 2012 permit, and the trial court specifically found that that type of logic kind of flew in the face of the California Water Code specifically. So that's a legal issue that's been decided by the trial court specifically. It's on appeal now, admittedly, but I'm biased obviously, but we'll maintain that we will likely prevail on that claim. So I just want to make that very clear that when looking at whether or not the permit should include numeric effluent limits, you should look at those costs of doing so now. Second, there was a comment earlier regarding the MEP versus the necessary and appropriate standards under California Water Code section 1342 P3B. To be clear, Duarte is not in the camp saying that the regional board is limited by law to the MEP standard. We acknowledge and have never argued, at least in the Duarte case, that as the law currently stands, the regional board does have the authority to go beyond the MEP standard. But when doing so, as I just said, that's a matter of discretion, which means that you need to comply with the California Water Code when implementing that authority. Let me rephrase it. When implementing that discretion.
Sorry, Mr. Van Litten, you have 1 minute remaining.
That's fine, thank you. So those are the, some of the key issues I wanted to address right now. Going forward, I would point out that Duarte has previously said, and we agree with Ventura County, that looking at other permits, especially for instance, the Caltrans permits, which is subject to the very same TMDLs at issue here, where they don't have NEL provisions like the ones that are currently in the LA MS4 permit, but are rather subject to a BMP-based only standard, that the board consider looking at something like that going forward to allow the permittees to continue to dedicate what funds they can and what resources they can to make meaningful strides to bettering water quality, while also making it so that the boards, the permittees, excuse me, have the ability to ensure that they are able to demonstrate clear compliance with those BMP related requirements. With that, if there's any questions now, I know we said we might push the questions till later, but I'm here obviously all day, so I'd be happy to answer questions that you might have. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think we're going to jump right to our next presentation, which will be a joint presentation with Annalise Moe, Corey Bell, Arthur Pugsley, and Daniel Cooper. You have 15 minutes. Thank you.
All right, looks like we're all ready to go. So I'll be starting us off this morning. Good morning, Chair Munoz, members of the board and staff. Today, as mentioned, we have a joint presentation for you from Heal the Bay, LA Waterkeeper, and the Natural Resources Defense Council. For the record, my name is Annalise Moe. I'm the water quality scientist with Heal the Bay. My colleagues will introduce themselves shortly as well. Now I'd first like to thank the board and staff for hosting this workshop so that we can all engage on this really important conversation. Next slide, please. So I believe your staff covered well the legal requirements around incorporating TMDLs into the MS4 permit. Before we dive back into the specifics on this, I'd like to take a quick step back to where all of our work stems from, and that's the Clean Water Act. Now, prior to 1972, there was a federal water quality law on the books, but conditions continued to degrade, leading to many environmental catastrophes, including the Cuyahoga River catching on fire multiple times. Public outcry and political momentum finally brought us to get amendments to the Clean Water Act in 1972, and this was to protect public and environmental health. Now, under this federal law, limits are set on various contaminants to ensure that, for example, copper levels do not become toxic to marine life, or that bacteria does not pose serious risk to the health of human recreators. These are not arbitrary numbers. These are not goals that we are trying to achieve. They are requirements because they are the levels that avoid killing aquatic life or making people sick. We must keep pollutants below these levels for the health and the resiliency of our communities, because everyone deserves access to clean, safe water and a healthy environment. Now, this law is to protect everyone. Historically, wealthier communities have benefited more, and our work now is to ensure that less wealthy, more burdened communities get their right to clean water too. That is why new funding like Measure W contains requirements to invest in communities that need it most. And that's why this permit has to back that up by committing to environmental justice communities. The Clean Water Act is set up so that implementation happens locally. So it is almost entirely through these NPDES permits that we have the opportunity to fulfill the intention of the Clean Water Act to protect all people. Now, since stormwater is a leading source of pollution, that must happen through the MS4 permit by making sure that water quality standards are met to ensure access to safe and clean water, not just for a select few, but for every resident of the Los Angeles region. So with that, if we can go to the next slide, and I will pass things over, I believe, to Arthur.
Yes, thanks, Annalisa. Hello, my name is Arthur Pugsley. I'm the senior attorney with Los Angeles Waterkeeper. And the purpose, actually, I wanted to make a note on the poll we took earlier before I begin my formal remarks, that as I counted it, at the time there were 100 people in the room and 96 were somehow related to the interests of dischargers. And I think the four of us from this presentation were the only four who had a sort of a more NGO or community perspective. So I think maybe there could be some more extensive engagement with a diverse set of voices. But what I want to stress here is that TMDLs have been going on a long time. There was a consent decree with EPA back in the 1990s that involved our groups that sort of started this whole process running. And many of these TMDLs have involved an extensive public process. There was a lot of negotiation and a lot of compromises were made. And really, for us, the MS4 permit is absolutely crucial to effectuating the purpose of the TMDLs. And we really have to make sure that the permit effectuates the TMDLs. I think we've heard a lot of the legal background earlier on why that's the case. For just one example, I want to run through and then I'll pass it on, is an example of bacteria in the upper LA River watershed. This TMDL was adopted after a lot of negotiations, again, with our groups as part of a working group in 2010. And first of all, we had to compromise on the effective date. There was, a dispute over when the effective date should be taking place. And Hilda Bay and Waterkeeper had to basically yield 10 years as part of that compromise. The second compromise was that if dischargers elected to do something called a load reduction strategy, almost like a little EWIMP within the TMDL, they would get an automatic 5-year extension. So we again thought, well, a coordinated approach is good, so we'll make that compromise as well. In 2019, dischargers again requested an additional 5 years, having basically made no progress with the first 5 years on developing the load reduction strategies. Today, dischargers are asking for a 10-year extension due to the COVID crisis. As a result, water quality here we're not getting anywhere. We have a TMDL on the books, and years later now, it will be decades later, we're still developing plans to comply when it's time to comply. So I just want to make sure that everyone is aware as you're going through the MS4 permit, coupling it with just extensions of TMDLs unadorned is not the way to go. So I would urge everyone to not take that route. And with that, I'd like to turn it over, I believe, to Corey Bell from NRDC.
Hi, this is Corey. Can you hear me?
Yes, you can be heard.
Okay, great. So, Ira, could you skip to the next slide, please? This is the slide that Arthur just took us through, so I wanted to bring it up so you have a chance to see the various compromises that took place for just this one TMDL. And now the next slide, please. Thank you. So I'm going to speak briefly about how the MS4 permit safe harbors would work in concert with requested extensions to final TMDL deadlines to create bad public policy. That's because the safe harbors or deemed compliance pathway in the existing and also the proposed permit eliminate the need to comply with interim TMDL deadlines. Extensions to final TMDL deadlines would again delay final compliance, as you saw in the previous slide, having lasting negative effects on public and environmental health. Listed here on the slide, you'll see the water bodies where pollution has either gotten worse or shown no improvement during the course of the 2012 permit. And this comes from the Regional Board's own analysis contained in the draft permits fact sheet. I'll also note that this list is not exhaustive and it's quite lengthy. This worsening water quality is at least partly due to the permit's suspension of compliance with interim TMDL deadlines, or what the board is calling the hybrid approach. The current draft MS4 permit continues down this path, and if final TMDL deadlines are extended as well, this list is only going to get longer and pollution will intensify. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Daniel.
Hi, can I have the next slide? Thank you. And my name is Daniel Cooper. I'm also here on behalf of Los Angeles Waterkeeper. And I think it's important to note that that implementation of the TMDLs into the permit as required by the Clean Water Act doesn't mean that the NGOs are expecting instantaneous compliance with all of the wastewater allocations or water quality-based effluent limitations associated with those TMDLs. Instead, we're saying that the implementation of those requirements into the permit are required by law, and that the regional board through this permit can't legalize ongoing pollution of our receiving waters by not including those TMDL water quality standards and waste load allocations in the permit. But we've started discussions with staff and the cities about what we'll call additional or alternative compliance evaluation. And we've been proposing or discussing with the state, with the regional board and with the dischargers, a volumetric standard where there would be a numeric volumetric reduction generated through the WIMPs and EWIMPs and the reasonable assurance analysis that's required by the existing permit and will be continued in the future permit, and that there be annual percentages of volumetric reduction heading toward ultimate compliance with the waste load allocation from the TMDL. And that would provide a easy way of evaluating whether the BMPs that result in those volumetric reductions are actually being implemented. We note that currently it's somewhere in the range of 3 to 4% of the BMPs already identified as required to achieve compliance have been implemented, 3 to 4% during the 7-year life of the permit, which in our view is not the way to get to ultimate compliance. If we had a more meaningful percent reduction on an annual basis, and our proposal would be that at the end of the 5-year life of the permit, 5-year permit term, the 50% volumetric reduction would be achieved. We think that would be a way of ensuring meaningful progress toward ultimate compliance with the TMDLs. So we're not asking for instantaneous compliance. We're not threatening immediate enforcement against every city and gigantic attorney's fees and costs and so on. Instead, we think that there's a means for measuring progress, but that the TMDLs and the waste load allocations must be included in the permits now to ensure progress and compliance with law. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll now have another Q&A session. So I don't see any hand raised at the moment. So I'll give you a moment if you would like to raise your hand or just speak out.
This is Jim Stahl. The question I asked of Mr. Cooper in the clarification of his volumetric reduction that he discussed, it's a 50% reduction over what time period? I think that's an interesting thought on his part, and I just wanted to understand more of the details.
Yeah, the idea is to have a percentage reduction, and we understand it needs to start a bit slowly as the WIMPs and EWIMPs are implemented, so a smaller percentage in year 1, but the concept is that by year 5 of the permits typically have a 5-year term under the Clean Water Act, that at year 5 there would be a 50% reduction, and the total amount of volume to achieve the waste load allocation would be determined using the reasonable assurance analysis and the modeling exercise in the WIMP. So the total number of BMPs required to achieve that volumetric reduction sufficient to meet the waste load allocation would be determined through the model. And then the idea is during the 5-year life, the permittee would get halfway there to that volumetric reduction. And the schedule, that's open to negotiation, the schedule to get to that 50%. We would work that out with the state board and the dischargers, hopefully through discussions.
But the 50% reduction, the baseline, if you will, what I'm going to reduce, the total volume that I begin with, would come about through modeling? Exactly. So it would include both wet and dry weather flow and the 85th percentile storm in essence. Well, I know that's getting into the details, but I think it is important from the standpoint of people that have to, the permittees that have to implement this and comply with what you're talking about here, is the total volume that needs to be addressed. And I'm not expecting an answer from you today. I'm just saying I think that's an important element of the success of that kind of an approach.
Yeah, just to confirm, the dry weather discharges are prohibited under the Act under MS4 permits, and every MS4 permit I've seen requires that they be prohibited.
Yes,
So
agreed.
we're talking about wet weather here, I think, and so that the idea is we didn't want to get into a debate about how that volumetric reduction is calculated. We have made comments on the methodology for the WIMPs and EWIMPs in the past, and there is an order issued by the state board, as a draft order in response to our petition on that. But leaving that aside, whatever it is that the WIMPs and EWIMPs methodology is, that is how that volumetric reduction would be calculated via that model and the reasonable assurance analysis, and then that would become the basis for this numeric ramp down or ramp up, however you want to put it.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
If I may, I want to follow up with Mr. Cooper about this approach so that we can tease it out and discuss it a little more. What do you envision at the end of the permit term? So do you envision numeric effluent limits at the end of this period that you're talking about, or are you proposing that volume reduction alone would be the WQBEL?
No, the volumetric reduction would be a BAT-based, best available technology-based limit. And so just to frame it up for the board members, every NPDES permit issued under the Clean Water Act has to have both a technology-based limitation and a water quality-based limitation. So the water quality-based effluent limits and the wastewater allocations that we're talking about here that are being implemented under the TMDLs are the water quality half of the equation. So that would stay as contemplated by the board, in our view. And while we have problems with the way that's drafted, including specifically the safe harbor provisions, basically immunizing dischargers from compliance with water quality standards, at least for the life of their WIMPs and EWIMPs. We have problems with that, but we can live with that if, on the flip side, the technology-based limitations would include this volumetric reduction. So everybody knows that there's real meaningful progress towards compliance with the water quality-based effluent limitations achieved during the life of the permit. And so that's that 50% volumetric reduction, but it's technology-based. It's which BMPs are being put in the ground, and it doesn't affect the water quality half of the permit.
So are you proposing that permittees would be allowed to do this technology-based approach of volume capture during the TMDL implementation period, but at the end of the TMDL implementation period, permittees would be subject to numeric effluents? Is that what you're proposing?
No. No.
No.
No.
Are you support? Are we? Because I just want to make sure that. Well, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. Again, the water quality base half of the permit would stay intact as you have proposed it, so that the TMDL wasteload allocations would be incorporated into the permit as required by the Act. And this would be a technology-based limit on top of that, which would ensure that while folks are under the safe harbor as to water quality-based effluent limitations, that there would still be meaningful progress during the 5-year life of the permit. Yes.
So just so that the board understands, because the purpose of this workshop was to discuss how do we incorporate water quality-based effluents into the permit limit. Yes. Into the permit. And so you're saying that you support staff's proposal for the incorporation of water quality-based effluent limits as that hybrid approach that Renee discussed, but that on top of that, you would like this volumetric approach to demonstrate compliance with more technology-based effluent limitation. I just want to make sure that the board understands you're not proposing substituting the water quality, a numeric effluent limit with this approach, if I'm understanding you right.
Yes, and that's an important point to make. We're not proposing substitution. We're proposing that we would accept the safe harbor language associated with the hybrid proposal made by staff in the draft, so long as there was also a measurable means of demonstrating progress while that safe harbor applied. And that would be this volumetric reduction during the 5-year life of the permit.
Thank you. Okay, sorry, I took up a lot of time. I just want to make sure I understood that.
That's important to clarify, so thank you for running me through that.
Chair Munoz?
Yeah, but I have a couple of comments on the testimony we just heard. I actually agree with probably 99.9% of what I heard. And let me emphasize the one points that I think that are very critical here. The fact that it was stated that we need to ensure all communities be considered, including EJ neighborhoods. Most of our work is done for those communities. My disappointment, as I have said previously, is that folks who live in those neighborhoods do not come and speak up and speak out about their issues and their concerns. They started to. We had a success at our last meeting where we had 5 members who spoke in Spanish to us. Our failure was that we didn't have translators, but we're correcting that. So we are out there working the neighborhoods to talk to people about who we are and what we do, because the reality of it, many of them don't even know we exist. That's the truth, because I'm out there in a long process. I've been on the board for 9 years, and we're just seeing some of the results of that work. I agree that we need more diverse voices, and so I ask that you encourage other diverse voices to come before our board so we have everyone's making that encouragement. I think I'm one of the board members who has been very vocal about not liking extensions, and that's still my thought unless there are good reasons for it. So I wanted to let you know that there are some of us who really think about extensions when they're requested. The one thing that takes me back, because I think your presentation was very positive and productive, but someone did say it was on one of your slides that you're dismayed at the lack of meaningful implementation. So could someone explain what you mean exactly by that? Because what we're hoping to do for this next permit is to make it doable so the permittees can have accomplishments and they can be successful, and that we give them the time in which to do it, and that we do it so that it's economically feasible, especially during this COVID period. Doesn't mean that they should be doing nothing. No, if anything, city leaders are responsible for the health of their constituents, their residents, and their environment. So I guess so if you could explain exactly what you mean by your dismay of the lack of meaningful implementation, so that I get what you're saying. Mr. Cooper, are you prepared to make, or Ms. Moe?
I think Corey is probably the appropriate person to respond to that. Corey, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. So I think Heal the Bay presented a report several months ago about progress under the EWIMP programs, the EWIMPs, and found that it was in the single digits for most programs, and that they were not on track to meet the requirements in their programs. And I think that part of the reason why there's been so little progress is because there's no threat of enforcement, and there isn't a whole lot of oversight or accountability when it comes to actual implementation of the programs and what's happening in the annual reports. And so when Heal the Bay and we dug into these annual reports and matched it up with what was happening, what was supposed to be happening under the programs, we found that there was a tremendous amount of discrepancy, I'll say, between what was supposed to happen and what was actually happening.
Yeah, and if I can just add very quickly to that, as Corey mentioned, the report did show that, you know, many of the EWIMP groups were not making the type of progress that was planned in their EWIMPs. Some of them even, it was below 1% progress made as of what was expected. And so what we're proposing here is the alternative is a way to better track that, so at every year we understand what progress is being made rather than looking back a decade behind. And also, again, the meaningful implementation of, you know, ramping up, maybe starting with 5 or 10% in the first year. So starting small, but then from there. And that's what we see as meaningful implementation rather than only seeing, you know, less than 10% over an entire 5-year period.
I'm going to ask staff to respond to what they just heard, and as well as the safe harbors comments. But before I do that, I do want to state this, I think the third or fourth time. Vice Chair Yee and I in the past have asked the environmental groups who presented to us today whether they would be willing to partner with one of the Southeast cities and work with them to provide them with capacity, maybe your scientists, so that they can learn from you. Maywood, for example, has 3 staff members who work at the city. I know it's only a 1-mile block radius city, but it's highly congested. And the purpose that we thought of this idea is that it really makes a difference for them to learn from your capacity and your expertise of your scientists, and for you to learn their circumstances in which they find themselves in. It would be mutually beneficial if that were to happen, and that hasn't happened. And so once again, I'm asking that you consider that. I know that right now things are very tight. I know that many of us are working with less staff than before. I know it's difficult to even interface with anyone due to coronavirus, but maybe when we're out of that, if you think about that, because when you're out in the field and talking to these folks and you're walking the streets and you're making observations, you get a more fuller understanding of the struggles and challenges that people are going through. So give that some thought, and I would love to sit down and talk to all 3 of you or over a Zoom call with Vice Chair Yee so we can talk a little more about that. So Ms. Purdy, can you respond to some of the comments, including the safe harbors comment and other things that they brought up that I think staff should respond to?
Yes, I will respond briefly. I do want to try to keep it short. I know we are once again running behind, and I want to try to make sure that we're staying also as close to the topic. We knew we were going to have a tight agenda. I'm going to try to allow us to move on. I see Rebecca wants to try to do the same. So quickly, with regard to the comments about the progress, you know, I think that we all recognize that during this first permit term under the watershed management programs and the enhanced watershed management programs, that there was a significant amount of time dedicated to planning, developing those programs, and getting them started. There is a significant way to go, and we recognize that. The board staff has also, just like these groups has been looking at the progress as reported in the annual reports. And we know that there is still a lot that needs to be done. The permittees, I think, know that there's a lot that still needs to be done. It's a very large undertaking. So we understand that progress is, you know, there's a long ways to go. With regard to the safe harbors, what I would say just very quickly, I mean, I hear the group of speakers right now saying that with the proposal that they've put on the table, that they would be willing to accept, live with, I don't know what words, I won't try to put words in your mouths, but that they would be willing to, I'll use the word accept, the proposal that we have, which is a hybrid approach. We refer to an alternative compliance path, which in the terminology that we're using with these speakers right now, they refer to as a safe harbor. So essentially the alternative compliance path of the watershed management programs is what deems permittees in compliance with the numeric water quality-based effluent limitations as they are implementing the BMPs that they have committed to on the schedule that they have committed to implementing them. So that is essentially that is our alternative compliance path that I presented in my slides as the alternative, which includes both numeric water quality based effluent limitations and then also the BMP-based requirements in the watershed management programs. And I'm gonna keep it at that. Of course, like you know me, I could talk on and on about this, but we are behind schedule.
Thank you.
In respect to the rest of our speakers and giving all of you time to have some time to talk at the end, it probably is necessary to move on.
Yes, we had scheduled a 10-minute break. I think it might be good to still take a 10-minute break, let everybody get up, stretch, get some more coffee. So we will resume at 11:25 or 11:29 promptly. I think if I do the math right.
Oh, that's a little more time than 10.
I'm sorry, I'm okay.
11:25.
11:25, yes. Thank you, Renee.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, Iram.
Just waiting for most of the board members to come back, and then we will resume in a minute.
That sounds good. And Iram, I think as long as, let's see, let's wait. Oh, you know what? You can go ahead and proceed.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So Angie, will you please start recording again? We had paused the recording for the break time.
Yes, we're recording here.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, so now we will resume our speaker presentations. Our next speaker is Margaret Clark from City of Rosemead. She has 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I've been on the Rosemead City Council for a long time and very interested in environmental issues. First of all, as the board knows, the City of Rosemead submitted a letter in April concerning a resolution that we adopted, calling the board's attention, first of all, to the loss of revenue from COVID. I think everybody's suffering and everybody knows that. We also addressed the issue of the metals TMDL, which do not apply to Rosemead. Rosemead is in Reach 2 of the Rio Hondo, which is not 303D listed for any metals. And Rosemead also drains to an engineered channels, which are exempt from the bacteria TMDLs because of the high flow suspension regulation. The resolution further pointed out that federal regulations require MS4 permittees to comply only with the Stormwater Management Program, SWIMP, governed by an iterative process. The regulations say nothing about the EWIMPs. Cost of EWIMP compliance for Rosemead is in the millions, and our Measure W allotment doesn't come near that. By removing the metals and bacteria TMDLs in the next permit for Rosemead, our city, which is likely to suffer more financially because of the pandemic, will be spared this unnecessary expenditure. And what I'd like the board to address that, and also what I wanted to mention is I was on the meeting last week, and when you had someone from the Water Quality Authority, which I helped form in the early 90s, and I've been involved with the board for over 25 years. And that was formed to oversee the groundwater cleanup for the pollutants that are in our groundwater. And one of the other, that I'm glad that the environmental community is on this call. I hope they're still on, because I was one of the early members of Dorothy Green's founding, she founded Heal the Bay, of course, and she founded the Watershed Council, which we met every month for years. And we even met in her house, and she was a wonderful lady. I miss her. And I represented cities, and we talked about all these things, and I brought up the issue because of the Water Quality Authority, which knows there's pollution in the groundwater. How do we know that if we're infiltrating water through the soil with distributed capture, that we are not polluting the groundwater? And I always ask that, Mark Gold probably remembers me asking that, that we're not taking the surface stormwater pollution and putting in the groundwater. And then when a couple years ago, when the state board held a webinar, Dr. Luthi actually brought up that we don't know enough about the infiltration to know that it won't pollute the groundwater. And so I would like the environmental community to study that, and I wish we could have more meetings like this where we can actually dialogue. And so we do, we really like what Board Member Stahl mentioned last week about the recycled water project with the sanitation districts. And I'm wondering, since there are no projects in the EWIMP, the upper LA EWIMP that we're in and actually categorized in there, there are no project in Rosemead. So would we be able to contribute our Measure W money to the sanitation district recycle projects? I think that would be wonderful, and I'd like the board to consider that for us. And so I think my time up. But anyway, I really do appreciate this time where we can actually dialogue, have Q&A, and I wish that we could have more of these and more times where we could discuss what we're actually pushing for, because we want clean water. That's why I've been involved in the environmental issues for years. I serve on the National League of Cities, the state league, the SCAG, all of their energy environment committees, because I'm very concerned that we do this right and we don't 10 years down the road, oops, we polluted the groundwater. So I'd like the environmental community to address that and look into it. So that's all I have to say. Thank you so much. And thank you for postponing the adoption till we get through this crisis.
Thank you, Margaret. We will now have our next speaker, Mr. Glenn Cow from City of Norwalk. And just a quick announcement. So we will have all our speakers, and then we will have a Q&A session after our last speaker. So please go ahead, Mr. Glenn. Glenn Cow, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair and board members. The City of Norwalk, in my opinion, should not be subject to any of the metals TMDLs because they are not on the 303D list. Instead, the permit requires the City of Norwalk and other cities in the upper and lower San Gabriel River to comply with the metals TMDL, with the metals, copper, lead, selenium, and zinc. The data used for the establishment of the metals TMDLs was collected back in 2007, which we've heard in earlier presentations with you in meetings, and has not been updated nor collected on a regular basis, it appears, to determine whether or not the current use controls are achieving the desired results. The City of Norwalk and other permittees that drain to flood control channels should also not be subject to compliance with bacteria TMDLs because of the high flow suspension regulation, as you just heard from the previous speaker. The EWIMPs and WIMPs are not based on credible cost-benefit analyses, in our opinion, especially given that permittees are not subject to the metals TMDLs, which account for most of the compliance costs, and that most cities are not subject to the bacteria TMDL. As the previous speaker also had said, the cities are very challenged right now with the ongoing COVID-19 response, and a lot of revenues being reduced coming into the cities. Instead, we recommend, based on the federal requirements, that the SWIMP iterative process be utilized as for compliance. Thank you. I'm sure you might have some further questions later under the Q&A.
Thank you, Mr. Glenn. Now we will move on to our next speaker, Mr. Ray Tahir from Tex Environmental. You have 5 minutes. Mr. Tahir, are you able to unmute yourself?
Yeah, I just did so. I'm just
okay. Wonderful. Go ahead, please.
How come you haven't flashed my handsome face on your video thingy? Just kidding. I'm just kidding.
Mr. Tahir, this is Sophie Froelich. Prior to beginning, because I don't see it's listed on your PowerPoint, could you please identify the folks whom you're representing here today? That's an APA requirement.
I'm just representing the public today. Good enough? Okie doke. Before I start my presentation, I must disagree with legal counsel regarding 40 CFR 122.44. It doesn't apply to MS4s, only to discharges that are subject to Clean Water Act 301. That's mentioned right in the regulation, which I just sent counsel. Further, technically based effluent limits cannot be associated with MEP because it is a requirement of 301. This is stated in 4122.44A1. Further, US EPA in a letter to the water boards in 2016 said that it envisions the application of the MEP standard as an iterative process, that is, successive iterations of a mix of BMPs, which will be driven by the objective of assuring maintenance with water quality standards. A word about compliance schedules. They are not required under state and federal law, contrary to what staff has asserted. Renee Purdy has relied on CFR 4122.47 compliance schedules to justify them in MS4 permits. But according to US EPA, in a letter it issued to the California boards in 2007, 122.47 only applies to 301 discharges. Now I'll get on with my presentation. So could you advance the next slide, please? Recommendation 1, and this has been said before, the current and proposed permit requires TMDLs that are not on the 303D list. So this includes Arroyo Seco Reaches 1, 2, and 3, Rio Hondo Reach 2, San Gabriel River Reach 3, San Gabriel River Reach 2, with the exception of lead, but that's questionable. Next slide, please. San Gabriel Reach 1 is not listed for all metals. Same thing with the estuary is the only exception. Copper is listed. Coyote Creek is also listed for copper. However, for San Jose Creek Reach 1 and Reach 2, no metals are listed. Next slide, please. Rio Hondo is not listed for lead, zinc, and selenium, but is listed for copper. Reach 1 of the LA River is not listed for copper, selenium, and zinc, but is listed for lead. By the way, this should be delisted because in 2018, US EPA removed it from CTR for all LA River reaches and tributaries. Reach 2 is not listed for selenium and zinc, but is for copper and lead. Reach 3 is not listed for lead, selenium, and zinc, but is listed for copper, based on inconclusive data. Reach 4 is not listed for any of the metals. Reach 5 is not listed for selenium and zinc, but is listed for copper and lead. LA River Reach 6 is not listed for lead and zinc, but not copper and selenium. This too is based on inconclusive data. Next slide, please. So, recommendation 2, identify in the next permit all reaches and all watersheds where specific life that is being impacted by metals. This typically includes fish, but we don't know what kind of fish, we don't know the size of the fish population. Next slide, please. Recommendation 3, remove lead from any reach or tributary of the LA River. Once again, this is based on US EPA's determination that lead be removed from CTR. Therefore, do not place lead for the LA River and tributary in the next MS4 permit. Amend the basin plan to reflect removal of TMDLs that are not on the 303D list. Be aware that with the exception of the bacteria TMDLs and trash, TMDLs, there are no other compliance schedules on the basin plan for MS4s. For state and federal law, compliance schedules only apply to NPDES permits subject to 301. Bacteria and trash TMDL compliance schedules for MS4s need to be removed. Apparently, they were placed in the basin plan by mistake. Mr. Cooper.
Excuse me, Mr. Tahir, you have 30 seconds to wrap up.
I'll make it quick. Mr. Cooper indicated that MS4 permits are 5-year permits, and that's true. And what has to be done in terms of addressing TMDLs and water quality standards, and the BMPs have to be scheduled on an implementation basis over the course of that 5-year permit. For example, the trash TMDL could be fashioned so that over the 5-year period, X number of trash controls will be installed in the city's catch basins. Next slide, please. Okay, and you talked about the high flow suspension rule. I think Councilman Clark and Mr. Cow mentioned that. Lastly, I want to point out that what determines compliance with TMDLs is the state's policy, which was just flashed earlier. So let's stick with that policy. And that's it. Thank you very much. And these sessions are very important. I think you need to continue to do them. And congratulate board staff for making this happen.
Thank you, Mr. Chihir. Now we will have our next speaker, Shahram Karagani from City of Los Angeles. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Eram. I appreciate that. Good morning, Madam Chair, board members, and water board staff. Thank you for the workshop. My name is Shahram Karagani. I'm representing City of Los Angeles, and I come from Department of Sanitation and Environment. Today's my presentation is focused on, is there any alternative plan to what we have been discussing? And the answer is yes. Very briefly, our plan is going to be built upon existing pathway in the permit, which the WIMS and the EWIMS. After updating our WIMS with the supporting RAA, we are planning to run the computer model to identify volume reduction. So that's the step number 1, outline the volume reduction, then we would translate the volume reduction to actual project. I rather use the word project as opposed to BMP. BMP is very, to me, soft, but when I say project means the scope, budget, the schedule, and it's more concrete in my mind. So once we have the volume reduction, we identify the projects. The next step is going to be that based on our level of funding that we have, everyone has identified that because of COVID and economic headwinds right now, our resources are limited right now. So I'm suggesting that based on the projects that we have and the level of funding that Measure W is going to provide, we identify projects. So that's the distinction, important distinction just to have. It would be Measure W funded projects that we identify the projects. The projects are going to put in 5 or 10-year capital improvement program. Again, a specific scope, budget, and schedule. So there is no ambiguity regarding the projects. And then obviously all of this that I'm mentioning to you is going to be done through a stakeholder driven process. It would be what with the water board, our NGO friends, our co-permittees, and all the stakeholders interested. So whoever has input into the projects, they are more than welcome to come. Once we have identified the project, we start, obviously we would receive approval from the water board for our plan or everyone's plan. It's not the city's plan, it would be the watershed plan with everyone input. And then we start implementing the project. What improves water quality is not talking about it, is actually doing project, implementing projects. I come from that perspective. I have implemented $500 million worth of Proposition O. I continue doing the similar thing with Measure W as well. Once we have done implemented the projects, then obviously, you know, because the plan has been blessed by the board or would have been blessed by the board, then the city would be deeming compliance once we have implemented the projects. Of course, on yearly basis, I will be reporting to the board regarding which project and how much volume of water I have removed from the watershed. So you see on yearly basis the progress that I have made based on the projects and their funding that they have. This makes it much easier. Water quality outcomes is easier to follow because it's project-based. You see the project, you do the project, you see how much we have removed, how much pollutant we have removed, load reduction, and also reduction exceedance. So it's much easier to report, it's more transparent, and it is much easier to follow as well. Similarly, by the way, to this right now, I know when Schuylkill County said Caltrans, but I would tell you, I am working with them on a Hollenbach Lake in city, and Hollenbach is one of the projects that I have that the Caltrans is contributing pollutant to So my approach, the one that I'm just explaining to you, is similar to the also to the Caltrans permit as well, that you could get credit by actually implementing projects. Last but not least, right now, by doing this alternative, it really, because we are doing projects, we are going to actually improve water quality with available resources that we have. And I request to work out with your staff board, Madam Chair, and others, our NGO friends and other stakeholders, to make sure we flesh out the details of this alternative. And I would be happy to answer any question that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. Next, we have Paul Alva, but just before we move on to him, I think there were multiple people named under your name. If I could ask if you could rename yourself or let me know for the record, and I will rename you. Okay.
Erin, are you talking to me or are you talking to me?
So on the panelist, I see 3 people, and that says Paul Alva. But okay, I see Paul. Hello, good morning. I'll have you speak, and I will hopefully I'll just leave everyone alone in case I do the wrong one. So please go ahead, Mr. Paul Alva from Los Angeles County, and you have 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Erin. Good morning, Chair Munoz and members of the board. My name is Paul Alva, and I'm an Assistant Deputy Director with Los Angeles County Public Works. Thank you for hosting today's workshop. Earlier this week, for the very first time, the Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors formally approved stormwater investment plans for 9 watershed areas as part of the Safe Clean Water program. This approval resulted in $95 million being allocated to 41 projects, 16 technical resource program projects, 4 scientific studies, and 12 watershed coordinators. This is excellent news for our region. Over $380 million is scheduled to be granted over the next 5 years, in addition to $340 million in matching funds. This equates to spending $720 million over the next 5 years in MS4 permit implementation. Even more great news beyond the $720 million is that $110 million will be given to municipalities each and every year beginning this fall as part of the Safe Clean Water program. This is an awesome watershed moment that could not be possible without the 2012 permit and the 2 attempts at a funding measure. In regards to the project funded by the Safe Clean Water program this first year, they will collectively capture over 61,000 acres. This is truly remarkable. With the pending draft MS4 permit, we have an unprecedented opportunity to continue what the regional board started with the 2012 MS4 permit. However, as we discuss the incorporation of the TMDLs in the next permit, it is important for all parties involved to understand that the pending state board order and the next MS4 permit could very easily derail our progress and cause unintended consequences. Since 2012, there has been unprecedented collaboration in our region and significant investments towards cleaner water, such as the development of watershed management plans, extensive water quality monitoring, development of a state-of-the-art computer model, and partnerships in program and project implementation. All of these were instrumental in leading up to the passage of Measure W and water quality improvements. Permittees have a chance to adaptively manage their watershed management program plans. The milestones and schedules associated with the TMDLs were established many years before we even knew what the solutions would be, how much money is needed, and before a dedicated funding source was established. We now have the funding in place and we know what type of projects need to be constructed. However, this enormous amount of effort takes time. The county has the strongest experience in constructing public works water quality projects. The county alone will complete 5 regional multi-benefit projects this year with a construction cost of over $100 million to capture 73 acre-feet. Based on our experience, it will take permittees approximately 5 to 6 years to complete a project from conception to completion of construction, and it will take another 2 years for permittees to optimize that project. Moreover, based on our experience, it will take about $1.5 million per acre-feet of volume captured.
Mr. Alva, 1 minute remaining.
Thank you, Ivar. In summary, please support extensions of the near-term TMDL deadlines. Permittees and voters of LA County have shown their commitment to clean water and are investing where it counts. Now they just need time to build the projects that we all support and the permit requires. This concludes my remarks. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak to you today.
Thank you, Mr. Alva. Our next speaker that we have is going to be Alex Takaki with the San Gabriel COG. And I'm sorry, repeat your last name for me.
It's Tachiki.
So sorry. Thank you, Mr. Tachiki. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good afternoon.
Sorry, just sorry for the interruption. Just to clarify for the record, do you also have another speaker that will be speaking with you?
No, it would just be myself.
Okay, all right, thank you. Please continue. Sorry for interrupting.
That's okay, thank you. Good afternoon, board and board staff. Thank you for allowing me the time to speak today and hosting this workshop. For the record, my name is Alex Tachiki. I work for the City of Monrovia, but I'm here in the capacity of representing the San Gabriel Valley Council of Governments. The COG and the member cities have concerns regarding the bacteria TMDL and the compliance schedule. Sufficient time must be accounted for in order to plan, design, construct, and operate projects and facilities. Given that many permittees rely on the Safe Clean Water funding currently for stormwater activities, timing and use of those funds will be a challenge, as already the stormwater investment plans are programmed for 5-year increments. With respect to the TMDL compliance schedules, the COG is recommending permittees be given flexibility based on available funds to comply with the regulations set forth in the permit. The Safe Clean Water program has a 40% local return program that gives permittees access to a dedicated funding source that Paul had alluded to earlier that cities have not had access to before. Cities also participate in the 50% regional program, but it's important to note that that program is a competitive application process, so it's not truly dedicated. However, it's given on a competitive basis. Historically, prior to the passage of Measure W, cities had to utilize general fund dollars in order to comply with the regulations set forth in prior permits. Now that we have Measure W funding, and with the successful efforts of many, we now have a dedicated funding source that LA County cities can use for stormwater programs and activities. The allowance of the permittees to use this dedicated funding source would provide a path of demonstrating progress towards goals of those projects and the TMDL deadlines. In closing, the 2012 MS4 permit provided a framework in which permittees could craft a roadmap towards TMDL compliance through WIMPs and EWIMPs. In 2018, as Paul and I had mentioned earlier, LA County voters passed Measure W, which allowed LA County to form the Safe Clean Water program. This provided a dedicated funding source for stormwater activities and gave access to permittees a fund source that we've never had access to before. Now that we have a roadmap and a funding source, permittees need time to implement their WIMPs and EWIMPs. Just as the 2012 permit took a huge leap forward in TMDL compliance, the Safe Clean Water program and the pending new MS4 permit have a chance to build upon that accomplishment by aligning scheduling and funding. The Safe Clean Water program provides a framework in which NGOs, business, and academia, along with cities, all have a seat at the table, and aligning the Safe Clean Water program would give flexibility to the permittees to comply with the regulations in the permit. This would allow everyone, all active stakeholders, to work together towards one common goal. Inherently, the stormwater investment plans can act as an adaptive watershed management plan, as they actually address the entire watershed rather than breaking it down by watershed groups. So I hope the board and the staff can consider that and taking into account the next permit. Thank you.
Thank you. We will now have our next speaker, Mr. John Hunter. He's representing the Lower LA River and Lower San Gabriel River permittees, and you have 5 minutes. Mr. John Hunter, are you able to unmute yourself?
No, I am not.
There we go. Go ahead.
So it looks like he was unmuted, Iram, and now he's muted again. Could somebody, one of the hosts, unmute him? There you go.
I think I'm in.
Yes, you are now.
Okay, apologize that. So anyway, yes, since I've probably already used up a minute of my time, I will go through this fairly rapidly. Yes, thank you for allowing me the opportunity to speak. If we could go to the next slide, please. A quick background. We do have a metals TMDL 2000 final deadline in 2016 in Lower San Gabriel 2018. And we have bacteria dry weather dates in 2020s. So those are coming up real quickly for us. And if we could have the next slide. I want to just say real quickly that we have had a very, very aggressive program at trying to get grants and funds for our watersheds. We have, just to name a few, Urban Orchard, the multi-jurisdictional biofiltration project, the Long Beach Musk, Carruthers Park, which are all moving forward or already complete. This was a lot of work to get those. And as Paul Alva alluded to, it's a whole new day right now with the Safe Clean Water program. And I, for one, am very excited about this and looking forward to this. Alex, just before me, did mention that our grants are still competitive, but we do have a much, much larger pool of funds to draw from, and we can really make a lot of progress in the next 10 years. Next slide, please. We've submitted multiple regional projects for funding in 2021, and as it happens, I've got another computer right beside me right now, and I am currently, and I will admit, while other speakers are talking, I am putting in about half a dozen applications because today is the due date for the next funding opportunity. These projects will take 4 to 7 years from funding to completion. But we are looking forward to those going forward. And next slide. So Renee had alluded to this slide. This slide is deceptively simple, but it is very important. Final TMDL compliance is going to be achieved through a mixture of non-structural BMPs, the LID ordinance and local Safe Clean Water funded projects, and the regional projects. So don't hold us as you look into the TMDLs to any one particular aspect of this. I like to think of this as a mix and match. We'll do one or the other or a combination thereof. Next slide, please. But of course, the most important one is going to be the large regional projects. They will be the primary factor in achieving the TMDL compliance. And I want to thank everybody that had worked on getting the Prop Measure W passed. The local agencies and the NGOs are going to have to work together on this. We're going to require time to ensure the optimization of the benefits. We don't want to just dig a hole, put water in it and cover it with a parking lot. We want to do water quality. We want to do nature-based solutions. We have to involve the community, and it's going to have to be cost effective. So next slide. So our recommendations for this, it's very, very simple. We know how much money, more or less, because it is competitive, but more or less we know how much money we're going to be getting per year from the Safe Clean Water Act. We know how much we're going to have to capture from the RAAs that we do. And by the way, this will probably have to be adjusted after June 2021 when our new RAA comes due. But you simply divide the amount of volume that we need by the amount of money coming in, and we can make some pretty accurate projections about when we're going to be able to get these projects done and how we're going to achieve that. So that would be certainly a recommendation of one way to look at how
Mr. Hunter, 1 minute.
Thank you. How to phase in the timelines for this. And we do need a buffer for this because some projects will get approved 1 year, another watershed area might get the funds the next year. So we do have to have a buffer or a cushion there. But when Measure W passed, everybody won. Well, everybody except the county of Ventura. But everybody in LA County won, and so it's time to start working together to do this. And I do foresee some real significant progress in, like I say, over the next decade. All right, next slide. Thank you. I'll be available for any questions.
Thank you. So now we have Mr. Rich Watson next, representing the Los Ritos Channel permittees. Rich, you have 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. Chair Munoz and members of the board, thank you, as other people have thanked you for this workshop today, and really appreciate this opportunity to speak. As mentioned, I'm a consultant to the Los Ritos Channel Watershed Group. Next slide, please. Today, I want to talk about 4 things primarily, 3 of them rather briefly. I want to talk a little bit about the relationship to recent comments on the triennial review, the proposed state board order, the tentative regional MS4 permit, a little bit about the overview of the TMDL situation, and then some personal observations based on my research and experience. And then I'm going to spend probably most time on a specific example of the Los Cerritos Channel watershed, because it's a permit or a watershed group that's had meaningful implementation during the last few years and made significant progress, and I'll talk about that. And lastly, I have a few specific recommendations. Next. With respect to the various recent comments, I think this is sort of an example of a basic law of ecology that everything's related to everything else. I recommend that if staff hasn't already done so, it should provide a summary of related comments that come out of the triennial review testimony on the state board order and other testimony on this particular regional permit, because a number of the things you want to do about including TMDLs are impacted by these other documents. The relationship between TMDL inclusion issue and the timing and contents of these other actions is really complex, and it's critical to look at that interaction. Next, please. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about the overview of the current TMDL situation. As noted in bullet 1, the staff's done a really good job of reviewing the background of the current TMDL situation. in the text, and I particularly refer to table F22, which presents some key dates for each of the existing TMDLs. And as mentioned by staff during the October 8th discussion of tentative regional permit, many of the TMDLs have optimistic compliance schedules. And I personally think several of them are very optimistic, and we could talk more about that. Staff has, however, recognized the problem with these optimistic schedules for at least 6 individual TMDLs and groups of TMDLs, which were discussed last time by Executive Officer or Assistant Executive Officer Jenny Newman, and may come up during discussion today. And staff has identified a basin plan amendment process for extension of some of the TMDL final deadlines, at least for those identified TMDLs, which they said would be released this month. Next slide. Okay, a few personal observations, just a bit of background. I've been involved with this particular watershed plan in the Los Cerritos Channel and the development of the TMDLs for metals in this channel and their implementation since 2008, when EPA first proposed the TMDLs. And one of my principal observations through the years is that staffs have, as I said before, been overly optimistic in establishing schedules. And it's understandable because they're trying to make them as short as possible to bring water bodies into compliance with water quality standards, which they're supposed to do. But they have been really optimistic. I've also observed that there's some critical water quality objectives that have not really caught up with current best science. And that's, I think, a particularly important issue. And it appears that a part of that is that lapse in catching up with science is just the lack of funding for basin planning. And there's not much we can say about that today, but I would encourage you to look at that in the future. Next slide, please. Okay, now I want to spend most of my time on the Los Cerritos Channel. As I mentioned, we've made some pretty meaningful progress, and I'll talk about that. The draft final of these metals TMDLs was put out by EPA in December of 2008. During 2009, there were actually a couple of translator studies done, one by the permittees and one by EPA Region 9. And Region 9 then developed some site-specific objectives for wet weather and dry weather with numeric targets. And the TMDLs were then established by EPA in March of 2010. And they have a final compliance date of September 2020, not 2016, as John mentioned. And it's the same plan as with the lower San Gabriel River. And there's some milestone dates. I've listed 3 of them in there. And since it was an EPA TMDL, there was actually no implementation plan when it was adopted. Next, please. So later, the regional board agreed to and actually did develop an implementation plan for both the lower Los Cerritos Channel and the lower San Gabriel River. And that was approved by your board on June 6th of 2013. In response to that, the regional watershed group established a multi-pronged strategy to address the TMDLs. One component of that is true source control. In other words, particularly the brake pad bill that we discussed before, and then the zinc petition to DTSC to control the zinc in tires. Our feeling is that if we can keep the pollutants out of the storm drains, then it reduces a lot of costs in the long run. Then we also implemented a dry weather runoff reduction to reduce that major transport mechanism of the extra runoff that we should be limiting in dry weather, as mentioned earlier. Next slide, please. We also then did a wet weather TSS reduction program, a little bit through sweeping, but mostly through soil stabilization, because the soil transport is another mechanism for transporting the metals. And then lastly, stormwater capture projects to capture pollutants. And we've been really fortunate as a watershed in that before Safe Clean Water program was adopted through Measure W and implemented, we were able to get funding a little less than $62 million for funding of 4 water capture projects those 4 projects collectively get almost 63 acre-feet of capacity. 2 of them have been operational for a while, and 2 more are under construction. 1 should be finished in the next month or so. So we've done a lot. We did actually achieve the 2017 milestone, which was a 30% reduction in dry weather and a 10% reduction in wet weather, which we demonstrated in an annual report. But it really doesn't look like we've met the 2020 milestone, which is a 35% reduction. We did, however, complete all the work we said we would do to achieve the milestone. But I'm also worried about meeting the future compliance dates, particularly these milestones, because the state board has tended to make some of these things almost into regulatory requirements. Next slide, please. Okay, as I say, we've done a lot to address copper and zinc, but it's not been enough. And in the state board order, they took some numbers out of an attachment to the RAA, which basically said we should have achieved 208.6 acre-feet of capacity by now. And we've only, as soon as we finish these last 2 projects, achieved about 63 acre-feet. And by the way, one of those projects that Paul mentioned earlier, we now have another $10.5 million project that's been approved by the Board of Supervisors. So that will give us some additional capacity in the next few years. So we've really done a lot. But what we really need, I think, is some of the standards to be brought up to date through adoption of the copper biotic ligand model, as well as the zinc biotic ligand model, and these are discussed in the training review, plus a delay in TMDL implementation schedule. And this gets at the schedule idea. Because it's separate from what's in the TMDLs themselves. You guys did the schedule, and I think you can extend it. It was overly optimistic, so we think it should be extended until the permit is adopted and becomes effective. Next slide, please. So a few recommendations. One, because you've talked about it in the...
And Mr. Watson, you have 1 minute.
Thank you. Because you've talked about this in the working proposal and in the fact sheet, I think you should get together with the steering committee chairs and the district and talk about the availability and distribution of funds. And also, excuse me, expand that basin plan amendment that's actually proposed right now, or create another one to look at other TMDLs that have deadlines before 2030. And that may be the desirable option there. Also, probably adopt a policy and guidelines how to demonstrate that we've completed all work associated with prior and current milestones. And the next slide, please. Last slide. Work with the state board to delay the update of the WMPs until 6 months after the effective date of the new permit, and then delay the update of the RAAs until 6 months later. Lastly, delay adoption of the new MS4 permit until after the basin plan or basin plan amendments that modified dates have been approved by EPA, and those dates can be put in the permit. And I would add one other recommendation, and that is you look very closely at Ventura County's proposed BMP expression of the WQBELS, but look at them for the entire permit area. Thank you very much, and I too will be available to answer questions.
Thank you, Mr. Watson. We now have our last speaker for today, Mr. David Wiesoff. Sorry if I pronounced your name incorrectly. And he's representing San Fernando Valley Audubon. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to speak on this MS4 at the workshop. My name is Dave Wiesoff, and I'm an active member of the Audubon Society, and speaking on behalf of more than 100,000 active bird lovers and their families who live in the Los Angeles and Ventura County watersheds covered by this proposed permit, as well as many visitors from all over the world. You can easily recognize birders by our binoculars, our long camera lenses, and our floppy hats. We are everywhere lurking watching birds. So you may not see us in the parks or whatever because we're hiding behind a tree, but there we are. Los Angeles County is the birdiest county in North America. More than 350 species of birds may be seen, either resident or migratory, during any given year. And of those, 200 species actively breed, build their nests, and fledge their young here. This is due to the wide variety of habitats found in our watersheds, including the high mountains, seashores, jetties, marshes, lagoons, deserts, rivers, and streams. Birds are everywhere, even in the LA River and its tributaries. We've all heard the term canary in a coal mine as an indicator of environmental health. When it comes to monitoring the effects of stormwater systems on our watersheds and our offshore waters, we can find local bellwether species, including pelicans over the bay, bald eagles on our islands, cormorants in our lakes, mallards in our streams, and gulls on our beaches. Some of these species were, of course, iconic bellwether victims of the Montrose Chemical Corporation DDT discharge. Additionally, let me emphasize, everywhere there is water, if only a little, there are birds, and their water must be clean, healthy, and free from pollutants. Our pervasive urban runoff constitutes a threat to many wildlife species, but especially to birds. As you know, while it is draining our cities of stormwater, it also pollutes our oceans with hazardous chemicals and debris, including tire rubber, many types of plastics, and persistent organic pollutants, which are ingested either directly or through bioaccumulation up the food web. Especially insidious is land-based plastic pollution. It is estimated that over 80% of seabirds ingest plastic regularly, and 1/3 have plastic in their stomachs. And my friends behind me, believe it or not, penguins are affected by our stormwater runoff because penguins represent, are of course in the Southern Ocean, but those seabirds in the Southern Ocean are actually ingesting more plastic than elsewhere. Our trash is moving down into that food web. We are now learning that virtually all aquatic life ingests plastics, including the smallest zooplankton, the largest whales, Renee, and turtles, and countless species of fish. I have been a volunteer ambassador for Heal the Bay for 14 years, attempting to teach folks of all ages to be environmental stewards. I've spoken to thousands of school children about the impacts of stormwater pollution on our ocean and its inhabitants, and the importance of keeping our watersheds clean. Along with additional citizen education, this MS4 permitting process is the most powerful tool to meet our responsibility to reduce and eventually eliminate all forms of stormwater pollution from our watersheds. This process, your process, must provide for rigorous, measurable action and emphasize accountability, responsibility, and transparency in the management of stormwater quality and urban runoff, and must keep the public informed. And finally, I just want to say that I know this is an incredibly complex process, but local bird lovers and I will actively study and participate in this MS4 permit process and assist in any way we can to help provide healthy ecosystems for us, our descendants, and our avian friends. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll now have our last Q&A session of the day, after which the board members will have the opportunity to discuss and the presentations and comments and ask any questions of the specific speakers. For this last Q&A, we're going to take questions from the audience on any of the speakers that we had this afternoon. I want to start off by reading an interesting comment we received from a participant with regards to, in San Bernardino and Ventura counties, the comprehensive nutrient reduction plans and the comprehensive bacteria reduction plans do not go through the board. The details of the implementation plans are handled by staff and approved on an EO level. I wanted to share that comment we received. It applies to both San Bernardino and Riverside counties. So the only
Thanks, Rebecca, for. Oh, go ahead.
No, Jenny, go ahead.
I was just going to say thank you for reading some of the comments that we've been getting from the workshop participants. I was just going to ask, did you want Renee or I to respond?
The only outstanding question, let me read the outstanding question we have from Mr. Travis Van Langton. This is to regional board staff. Following up on my prior questions, understanding how BMPs are defined by the regional board, is there anything a permittee can do aside from a BMP to meet the numeric effluent limitations in the current tentative permit? If so, what other measures? Would either Renee or you, Jenny, like to take that question? Or I can provide an answer and you can add to it if you like.
Well, I could start. I think that this is responding to a brief definition that I tried to provide in response to an earlier question that I believe may have been from Travis Van Langton in the Q&A. So generally, we often use the term BMP, I think, as a very simple, quick shorthand that covers a lot of different things for a lot of different types of control measures for stormwater and non-stormwater. And so when we talk about BMPs, we are often talking about both structural as well as non-structural controls. And it's probably maybe too much of a shorthand in some cases to adequately capture everything, but BMPs can include everything from those structural measures like regional stormwater capture type projects, also distributed projects like green infrastructure, nature-based solutions. BMPs, I think oftentimes when we're using the term BMPs, can even refer to things like low flow diversions for non-stormwater. It also refers to pollution prevention or source control. So considering something like the brake pad legislation that is reducing the source of copper in brake pads, which is then getting into our waterways. So we often use it as shorthand, like I said, for a very broad universe of control measures for stormwater and non-stormwater.
Thank you, Renee. Mr. Van Litten had a follow-up, and I think we would need to elevate him in order for him to speak. Let me see if I can.
I can do that, Rebecca. Hold on a second.
Sorry for the technical difficulties.
I just want to follow up on Ms. Gabaldon's question while you elevate Mr. Van Langton. I just wanted to acknowledge that she is speaking about an alternative way of incorporating a WQBEL in the permit as a BMP-based approach. And I think she's responding to, in Renee's presentation, Renee said that staff, one way to incorporate a BMP-based approach into the permit was by letting permittees submit plans for the BMPs that they would implement to meet the wasted allocations. And this is sort of similar to, I think, the proposal from Arnie Anselm from Ventura County. So that's one of the ways that water quality based effluent limits can be incorporated into a permit. And that's one of the options we're considering. And then I just wanted to reiterate what Renee said, was that staff at this point wasn't recommending that option because it's a bit it provides less flexibility, we think, to permittees because it has to go to the board for approval if it's revised. And Ms. Galbadon said that for the San Bernardino County and Riverside County MS4 permits, it was her understanding that those types of plans didn't need to go to the board. I feel like I'm getting in the weeds a bit here. But I just want to say that we are working with our Region 8 colleagues who oversee the San Bernardino and Riverside County permits. Our reading of the permits are different. We think that it does appear that those plans need to be going to the board for approval, and we think that such plans need to go to the board for approval. So anyway, this is an ongoing topic of discussion if the board wants to continue it, about how we would include a BMP-based approach into the permit. Staff isn't recommending this particular approach because we think it would provide less flexibility and be too burdensome. But anyway, that's I just wanted to make sure that we address that comment in the panel.
Thank you, Jenny. And we have, we have Travis Van Ligten here with us now.
Van Lighten, just for
I'm sorry.
No worries. It's confusing and confuses people I know very closely, so it's fine. So I just wanted to briefly touch on the question I was asking of regional board staff and why I think it's kind of germane, because I think it goes to the core discussion we're having to a degree regarding the BMP versus the NEL approach versus what the regional board staff and the tentative permit, I guess, purports to be the hybrid approach of the two. And ultimately, what I would like to convey, at least from Duarte's position, is that no matter what it is, whether or not the standard of compliance is a number, whether or not it's a numeric, parts per million, whatever it is, versus a narrative water quality standard, it doesn't really matter. Ultimately, the only way I can foresee a permittee ever complying, short of stopping all rain, I guess, would be through implementation of BMPs, which would consist of the variety of different control measures, programs, structural and non-structural, that a permittee can muster with the resources it has. And so I think one of the key issues that is from Duarte's position, and I think a number of the other permittees, is the fact that when we include the numeric element, the numeric WQBEL aspect of it, you would be essentially creating a point of liability, obviously, for the purposes of mandatory minimum penalties, the purposes of enforcement actions, and the purposes of third-party lawsuits. Whereas if you wanted to go through a BMP-based approach, what we're advocating for is really a selective suite of BMPs permittees can implement that allows them, that they can implement and must implement, mind you, so it's not like they're not doing anything, but would allow them to make meaningful progress without having the ultimate liability at the end should they fail to control the weather sufficiently. Why this is relevant now, though, with the purported hybrid approach is because I would argue it's not really a hybrid approach when the permit itself includes the numeric effluent limits, and I think the term used in the slideshow from staff was as a backstop, but that essentially just means that the numeric effluent limits are the standard at the end of the day. That is what must be met, and the only way to meet it is BMPs. And the reason the issue of whether or not there is something else a permittee can do aside from BMPs to meet that standard, which is why I asked the question, is relevant is because ultimately, and I think we can all agree logically, that there is nothing else a permittee can do aside from a suite of BMPs to try to address stormwater runoff. And so I think that's just the issue I wanted to convey, is that, you know, whether we call it the NEL-based approach or if we call it a hybrid-based approach, if the ultimate issue is that we need to meet a number, it's an NEL approach, which comes with its associated problem from a permittee standpoint, mind you. And if it's a BMP-based approach, the hope is that you'll still get meaningful development of projects or development of programs or implementation of all of the other variety of different types of BMPs that are available, while also giving permittees the ability and insurance to make the decision to invest their funds in specific projects on a going forward basis while knowing they're in compliance with their permit. with the added caveat that ultimately, if this board thinks that not enough progress is being made, of course, either every
Mr. Van Leyden, I'm going to have to ask to wrap up because we're short on time at this point, and now we really need to move to allow the board members to start the dialogue and ask all the remaining questions.
Not a problem. I was actually finishing my sentence. That was it. But so essentially what I was saying is that, well, I lost my train of thought, but ultimately the board should remember that ultimately the only way permittees can comply with this are BMPs at the end of the day. And that's just something I just wanted to convey, regardless of if we call it an NEL or a NEL or a hybrid approach. Thank you.
Just to let the board members know, we have elevated all of today's speakers to panelists. So if you have any questions of them, feel free to call them out and ask questions of them. And we'll just go until 12:55 for your discussion. Board Chair Munoz, would you like to start?
Actually, I would, but I feel like I've taken so much time that I wanted to defer it to my board members. And if there's time at that point, I will say something because I feel like I've bogarted a lot of the Q&A time period. So I'll defer to them. I'll defer to them first, and then if there's any time left, I will have my questions ready. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We have board member Stahl has his hand up, so please go ahead, sir.
Thank you. I have a couple of quick questions for the panelists. First, Ram Karagami of LA SAN. You, LA SAN, as an organization, submitted a letter on February 20th. This is before the tentative proposal came out, but commenting on the working proposal. And I think I referred to that earlier. And I wanted to be sure that your position, your organization's position, is the same as expressed in that letter, and that you're not making changes to it today. I didn't hear changes, but I think it's important to be sure that I'm correct in my assumption.
Board member Stott, you are correct. Our position is the same. Can you hear me?
Yes, no, I can hear you. Thank you.
Thank you.
And then the second question would be to Mr. Alva, the county. Paul, first of all, congratulations to you, to Mark, to the staff for the approval by the Board of Supervisors of the implementation plans. I think that's fantastic. But I'd also like to pursue, and maybe I'm not going to get the chance today, but I'd like to pursue with you the metric that you gave, and I believe I have this correct, that 61,000 acres over 5 years. I think you probably mean acre feet. But is that what you are referring to as the progress that has been made to this point in time?
That is the 61,000 acres of tributary area.
Of tributary area.
That's correct.
But to me, what's most important is the flow that's captured. And it was brought up by Waterkeeper when their proposal of talking about a 50% reduction. But again, it gets down to the amount of flow that you've captured and what you treat. And I would also say distinguish between wet weather and dry weather. I mean, you and I've talked about this on many occasions. I am particularly disappointed that after so many years, we still don't have a firm number as to what dry weather flow is. It's 100 MGD. Well, maybe it isn't 100 MGD. And yet the county is possessed of a tremendous amount of data, or possesses a tremendous amount of data in their gauging stations. And it seems to me that money on Measure W ought to be devoted to this fundamental foundation, if you will, of determining dry weather flow. Because as I know you would agree with me, the permit has been consistent in that dry weather flows are prohibited. And I know you're working hard in projects that you're putting in, But on the presentation that was made by Mr. Karagami last time, and my support of what they did on Biona Creek, that's on an average acre feet per year. Average, they're going to recover 12,000, and yet the project couldn't be funded. So I get off that box, but my point is that I think we have to take a much more aggressive approach to dry weather flow. And I think people perceive me as someone that's saying, well, build these diversions into the treatment plants of the sewers. Yes, I think that has to be part of it. But my ideal solution would be that you would identify where the dry weather flow is coming from and have source control. So we don't even have to worry about it. I want to say worry about it. It's not there. It's reduced in volume. I push for the fact that you would implement projects like Biona Creek, because if you will, they're almost a backup in case you aren't able to achieve the source control you'd want, or there are excursions in quality. Then you have the ability to divert it to the sewer and to the treatment plant. A lot of the projects that you have, for example, I congratulate you on Alondra Park. I think it's done wonderfully. So is Roosevelt Park. But Alondra Park has a connection to a sewer. So in essence, when that box is full, it diverts to the sewer. So it really is a diversion. So I think those metrics are important in terms of how much we're capturing, because that then puts us in a position to determine how far we have to go. Yeah. So I again, congratulate you on the Board of Supervisors approving that. But in terms of dry weather flow, I think we have a lot more to accomplish.
Thank you, Board Member Stahl. If I can just say a couple of things. We're also a supporter of these low flow diversions to capture dry weather runoff. And that is one of the reasons why we have about 24 low flow diversions and several in the pipeline for construction. And so we're also a funding partner in the white paper that is looking into how we can expand the number of low flow diversions and also look at whether we can capture additional wet weather flows. So we're a big supporter of that. We're a project funder. And so all we believe is that they should be treated as on a case-by-case basis, depending on the nearby infrastructure and depending on other technical issues. With regard to the Biona Creek project, the county and the flood control districts are strong supporters of the project. The flood control district is a significant funding partner, and all the cities that would benefit from the Biona Creek project are contributing partners towards the project. The county and the flood control district voted for the project under round one. Unfortunately, the watershed committee didn't fund it under round one, but it's my understanding that the city is going to resubmit the project for consideration as part of round two, which the deadline for submittal is today. We look forward to continuing supporting Biona Creek project. I agree with you, it is a worthwhile project with significant cost savings for everyone that is benefiting from such project. Lastly, on that project, the flood control district is expediting all the permit necessary to move the project forward. We've been working with the Army Corps, with regional board staff, with the city to make sure that we're accelerating that project as fast as we can. And all we're waiting for is Measure W funding. So I echo your comments, Board Member Stahl.
Thank you. Paul, I really do. And I'm sure all the board members treasure working with you, because we have both the same end, and that is water quality improvements. It's just that I've become, particularly with dry weather flow, just become very impatient, because I think the ability to capture a lot more, to optimize the 41 systems that you already have and take advantage of the data that's there is just a wonderful opportunity for us to accelerate improvements in water quality. So thank you.
As long as Mr. Alba has the floor, could I ask him a question?
Certainly.
Mr. Alba, I think I heard you say that the state water board's proposed order could derail this permit. Could you say what you meant by that, and especially in consideration of the TMDL Incorporation and compliance?
Yes, thank you, Board Member Yee. We provided testimony before the State Water Board workshop last week, and I shared with us the concerns that I expressed today and at the previous board meeting with regard to the state draft order. It was originally released late last year, and a second version was released a few weeks ago. And based on the latest version of the draft order, it is very prescriptive in what it's requiring the regional board to do in terms of deeming those permittees that have a watershed management plan, whether they're deemed in compliance with regard to their interim milestones. Those interim milestones, if they're not met, then they would be deemed out of compliance unless those interim milestones are approved by the regional board. So based on its totality, we believe that that state draft order is not consistent where this conversation with the new MS4 permit is going. It doesn't recognize the economic and political reality of our region, especially when it comes to Measure W. As I have testified in the past, Measure W brings $250 million of money towards water quality improvement projects each and every year. And unfortunately, the state draft order doesn't recognize that. We hope that the state board hears our comments, and I hope they would revisit the state draft order because the timing couldn't be worse. We're in the middle of a new MS4 permit being issued for this region. And at this time, it's at odds where this conversation is going, and making sure that we recognize the economic reality of our permittees in the region in light of COVID and other factors.
Thank you, Paul, for that explanation. And I actually share a lot of your concern.
Thank you very much.
I have a couple other quick comments, questions. Back to Arnie Anson. I think he made a very important statement that that this permit is going to have to be translated and clearly described to the decision makers throughout the region. But he was, speaking, of course, of Ventura County, because it's the decision makers that ultimately, have to be able to fund these types of projects and whatnot. So I think it's really important to make sure that this permit is as clear, coherent, and meaningful as possible, so that we can easily explain this to the decision makers in order to get, their support, and also to be able to explain it to the public, whose, wide support we need in order to move ahead. WQBEL said that she attributed the lack of meaningful compliance to the lack of enforcement. And I just want to point out what she said, because I think that bears we need to really unpack what she said by that for me to more clearly understand. And we don't have time for that today, but I just wanted to take note of that. And let's see. And then Mr. Watson said that that a lot of these TMDL deadlines and so on, that we've been way overly optimistic in what we are asking for. So my question, I guess, is, and I think, this has been partly answered already, that, what plans do we have to effectively extend TMDL deadlines? And I know we're working on, basin plan amendments and phasing certain things in, but staff, would you like to say anything more about that?
Sure. I can start, but I might then let Jenny take over, or we'll just keep the answer short. And we are working on a project, as the board knows, and as probably most of the attendees at the workshop here know. We are working on a project to evaluate some of the TMDLs where there's a final deadline coming up within the next 1 to 3 years. We understand that we have received requests for some extensions of other TMDLs that have final deadlines that are further in the future. We are first addressing the TMDLs with these imminent deadlines within the next 1 to 3 years. We plan to publicly notice that basin plan amendment in the very near future within the next couple weeks. And we certainly can consider additional TMDLs in the future in their schedules to see whether we should do a similar evaluation for some of those other TMDLs that have schedules that are further in the future. So we are working on that. That is something that will be publicly noticed soon. And I made a note to myself, I believe, I apologize, I don't remember now who it was who had said this, but somebody, I believe it was Mr. Watson, suggested that we delay the permit until that basin plan amendment was through the approval process with the revised TMDL deadlines. We've been discussing that we are on a parallel path, and it's not necessary to delay the permit adoption. And in fact, that wouldn't necessarily be that helpful because the current deadlines are in the current permits. And so what we have discussed doing with a number of permittees is reflecting 2 sets of deadlines in the tentative permit that we would bring to the board for consideration, meaning assuming the board acts on the proposed TMDL extensions that we will be publicly noticing, then we would be able to revise the tentative permit to reflect the current deadlines as well as the newly adopted revised deadlines, such that once they fully went through the approval process, they would become the operative deadlines in the new regional MS4 permit. So we've already thought through the process for how we can continue to move on a parallel path with both of these things at the same time.
Great, thanks, Renee. And finally, my appreciation to everyone who's been involved, not only in this meeting, but in many of the meetings previous to this. I know this process has seemed long and drawn out. And I would just say that one day, and hopefully one day soon, we are going to have a permit, and it's going to be a good permit, and we will do everything that we can possibly do to make it right. So thanks to everyone for all of your tremendous efforts.
Chair Munoz?
Yes. First of all, I want to echo Vice Chair Yee's thank yous for everybody's hard work. I know that everybody takes really focused and deliberate time and thought process to provide us with their insight, their opinions, their suggestions, and we hear them deeply. At least I do, and I know the rest of the board members, because we want a permit that we get buy-in, that we're not all going to agree on every aspect of it, but if we can get consensus from the majority, that's when it works, because this isn't our permit. I say this a couple of times. This permit is ours, big. And I'm talking about community-based organizations, nonprofits, permittees, partners, collaborators, us, the counties, etc. We all have that common goal, and that common goal is water quality compliance. And we have different ways of achieving it, but if we focus on that, and if you haven't spoken up and you haven't said anything and you're shy, write us your commentary so that they can be considered. This is what all this has been about, is to listen to you deeply, try to truly understand what you've been sharing with us. And we've done a lot of these meetings, and I really appreciate the folks that are on that have said nothing. or who are very quiet and are trying to contemplate if they will in the future. The one thing that I still have in the back of my head is what I had in the back of my head last time we passed a permit. And that is the whole issue of the cost of compliance. The economic analysis is that I hear outrageous numbers being thrown out without any backup. I mean, it's like they get pulled out of the air. And I'm not sure we can be exact about what it's going to cost, but I think that we should have a conversation about that. I know we've had several, but I'm still not real clear about the economic analysis, cost of compliance, and what that really means. And I know in speaking to our executive officer, I said, you know, what can we do so that people do comply? And she said, maybe we extend the time period. I like that idea. And we might have other ideas. Isn't the goal to reach compliance? And if we, instead of setting people up to fail and to set up for them to be fined, I mean, this is like a balancing act. But I want to balance to be with reaching an agreement where we have a permit that's doable, goals are reachable, and that we're moving forward step by step towards that. And so I think that what we heard today for me was very, very helpful. I want to make sure that if we have Councilmember Clark from Rosemead on the line still, I think she may have left, but I'm in awe that you worked with Dorothy Green and that since then that you continue, there you are, Ms. Clark, that you continue being such a fighter for water quality. And I want to let you know that you're our current Dorothy Green. And
Thank you.
I met her just once or twice, but I know her of reputation. So you keep on the battle and
I will.
You know,
Thank
keep
you
the
so
battle
much.
going for all of us. So those are my only comments, is that this is about everybody pitching in so that we have a doable, successful MS4 permit. Thank you.
Thank you.
Board Member Stahl or Board Member Guzman, do either of you have any questions or comments?
Well, I bow to Cynthia. She hasn't had a chance to talk, so I do have a comment, but please, if we run out of time, it should be Cynthia's.
Great. Well, I've been listening to all of you very intently, and I really appreciate those that took the time to answer the framing questions that were presented at the top of the workshop. Those were the presentations that were the most helpful to me, were the ones that specifically responded to that question, and in some cases even went the extra step proposing additional models or some language that, you know, in their view may work better based on their interests. So I personally found that really helpful in thinking through the issues. So I've been taking copious notes and just trying to understand the various issues and the concerns that folks have. And I think the board members have more or less expressed my concerns. I'm hearing a lot about the need for time, for additional time, for a variety of reasons, economic mostly. I'm also hearing about the life cycle of actually getting a project off the ground, from design, planning, getting money, lining up what you need to in order to get a project into the ground. And I'm obviously sensitive to that because I'm an urban planner and I know what that takes. So with that said, I was particularly struck by, at least in concept, by Mr. Cooper, I believe, his proposal of a volumetric reduction proposal, at least in concept. Maybe I'll just call it a reduction proposal for now, because I know the means for reduction is still very much up for discussion. But I'm very much interested in figuring out, you know, if more time were to be granted, what does year what does year X look like? What does year Y look like? What are some of the tangible things that we will see at that we may expect to see at that point? I certainly don't want to go back to this document, years from now and see if, that we, did not get as far along as we could. And I think rather than looking at it in hindsight, we should be able to have these conversations in real time, because we know things happen, and we should be able to have that ongoing conversation of, on the path to compliance, here's where we've done really well, and here's where things maybe went off the rails, and having some sort of, I'll call it a reduction proposal that tells us where we may expect to be in year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, is really helpful for us to know where we need to course correct, or where more time would be needed, or what additional resources need to be placed at folks' disposal. Because again, I'm very sensitive to the fact that folks said, we've been working on these for 20 years and we're just this far along. So I don't want to have that conversation in 5 to 7 years. I want to be able to have had versions of this conversation year to year to year, so we know where we are. So I don't think we have everything figured out, but I do think that I do think this conversation is a good stepping stone to get there. Again, I was really struck by the presentations that propose specific concepts and specific language, because I found those to be the most useful. So I look forward to more conversations such as these. I think they're going to be instrumental to coming up with a permit that is workable for as many interests as possible, and is ultimately protective of water quality, which is absolutely everybody's goal, and is the line of this board. So I'll stop there. Jim, there's 4 minutes for you.
Oh, you don't have to leave me anything, because I guess my closing remark is many more questions. Doesn't surprise you. It may be technical in nature, but I completely agree with the summary that Irma just presented from the standpoint of where we are and the importance of cost. And in 4 minutes, I can't go over my views in what was contained in attachment F. And I've read that whole document, and I do want to share with the board members my thoughts in that regard. But in terms of this to be continued, I think it is extremely important to go back and take a look at the letters that both the city of LA and in particularly Ventura and Arnie talked about from the standpoint of a collaborative effort, and bringing in other regulatory bodies that have gone a different way than us. I'm not saying that they went the right way, but they knew what we were doing and went a different way. And they care just about, I think, just as much water quality as we do. So I think in terms of walking around the permits so that we get the correct decision, that I think we need to involve them or understand why they went another way. So I'll leave it at that. And I would hope that at the November meeting or sometime after that, that we're able to have this kind of workshop that focuses on the alternatives that Ventura brought up, and certainly that the city of LA brought up. Thank you. I thank everybody. This has been, as always, very enlightening.
I would just add that we really have to do this well because all the birders are watching.
Even those in Oregon, huh?
Yeah.
Board members still on. Board members is still for 4 days. I don't know if you can see me and hear me. I unmuted and stopped and started my video. Can I respond momentarily to your question about what other people have done? Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Jennifer. Go right ahead.
So I want to make a comment about, the other approaches that have been raised today about particularly, the Caltrans permit, maybe what other regions have done. And you're right, there's different approaches. I would make one comment on the Caltrans permit. One is, that is the state board did do something differently for Caltrans. It was a unique type of permittee. It was one permittee. They have, the state board determined that they were not a significant contributor. And they have a lot of, obviously a lot of activities that they have to do statewide, and they cross many watersheds and many regions. So they did do something different. With that said, it is very important to note that some of the permits that are being raised as examples today do predate the state board's water quality order from 2015, which of course upholds with modifications the LA permit from 2012. The 2015 state board order does say that TMDL compliance schedules need to be complied with. And so it is my understanding, and I have a pretty good authority, and because it's been discussed publicly, is that the state board does intend to, it's revising the Caltrans permit, it's in the process, and is revisiting that issue. And one of the things that they're planning on doing is requiring compliance for the TMDL schedules and actually issuing time schedule orders. So I just want to make clear, what was done in the past may not necessarily be done in the future. And so it's really not a great comparison going forward. Mm-hmm. With that, if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer.
Jennifer, I think you're saying it may not, right?
I think likely not.
Well, that's why I want to explore it and understand it more, because may and likely mean that there's still the possibility, at least for the discussion, of why we are where we are.
And yeah, and that's correct. I mean, the state board's 2015 order, again, it's precedential, and it's something that they're also, it's precedential for them as well. So with that said, I think it's not really appropriate to compare things that were done like 10 years ago.
All right. Thank you. Iram, are we ready to move to, it seems as though we're ready to move to the wrap up.
Yes, definitely. Just quickly, did any other board members have any remaining comments that they wanted to share before I move on to the wrap up? Okay, wonderful. Seeing none, I will now move on to the next steps. So I will go ahead and share my screen. Okay, so just wanted to quick reminders for our tentative draft. Comments are now due on December 7th. We had an extension of the comment period. So please submit those by December 7, 2020, and email the PDF to our MS4 Stormwater RB4 email address. And I also wanted to make an announcement of our next workshop. We will be having another workshop, an MS4 workshop on the monitoring and reporting requirements of the Regional MS4 Permit. This has been scheduled for November 19, 2020 at 9 a.m. We plan to do a 3-hour workshop, so please save the date. And there will be a public notice going out soon, hopefully in the next 2 weeks or so. So that's it. I didn't have anything more to add. So this concludes our workshop for today. Renee, did you have any last announcements or anything else you wanted to share?
I don't have any last announcements, but I do want to just say that I very much appreciate everybody's participation today. I'm very pleased to see that we were up at, I don't remember the highest, around 130, I think at some point, in addition to our panelists. I really appreciate everybody spending their time preparing for this. And as board member Guzman and others have said, particularly those that responded to the specific prompts that we provided, it's been very insightful for us, and we have many things to think about, and we will be doing that, and I look forward to continuing the conversation. So just thank you everybody, and a huge thanks to our hosts. Iram and Ivar and Angane and the whole team, Rebecca, and those behind the scenes. I know that a lot of work went into this, and it seems like it went quite well. So thank you very much for pulling this together.
Great job, Renee.
Thank you. Now we will stop recording, and I will now announce the end of this workshop. Thank you everyone for attending. Have a wonderful